What if Harry was son of Hades, and his Patronus was a hellhound forged from the River Styx? A Harry Potter times Percy Jackson / Greek mythology crossover in 7 chapters. Chapter 1: The Daughter of the Threshold, the Lord of the Pit, and the boy who inherited both. There is a story the wizarding world tells itself about Lily Evans, and there is a story the gods tell, and the two have never agreed. The wizarding world's version is short and tidy and useful for hagiography. A red-haired Muggle-born from Cokeworth, charitable and clever and lethal at a duel, who married James Potter, gave birth to a son in the dying summer of 1980, and threw herself in the path of the killing curse 2 Hallowtide nights later because she loved that son more than she loved her life. That much, at least, is true. The wizards have always been very good at what is true and very bad at what is whole. The gods' version goes farther back. The gods' version starts not with a red-haired girl in a green dress at a wedding in 1978, but with a wisp of smoke at a crossroads in 1959, when Hecate, who is a great many things and almost never simple, knelt over a basket containing a newborn human child and considered her options. It was Hecate's habit, in those days, to seed the magical bloodlines of Britain quietly. She was old, and she remembered when sorcery on the British Isles had been a thing of moors and barrows and bone thrones, before it became a thing of pointed hats and acronymic government departments. The wizards, in her view, had grown narrow. She did not blame them. Most living things grew narrow given long enough and a thick enough roof, but she liked to introduce, every few generations, a thread of her own blood into their lineage, the way a careful gardener might splice an old wild rose into a bed of greenhouse hybrids. Most of these children grew up never knowing what they were. They simply turned out, on average, to be a little stranger than their schoolmates, and a little better at noticing the things that lived in the corners of rooms, and a little more inclined to be kind to dogs and crows. The child in the basket, that night at the crossroads in 1959, was the daughter of a Muggle nurse named Margaret Evans, and a man whose name does not survive. The nurse had lost her own baby in the same hospital ward, the previous afternoon, to a fever for which there was no fault and no defense. Hecate, who has presided over more thresholds than there are years in human history, considered the symmetry, considered the grief, considered the way the world's accounts sometimes balanced themselves out if one was patient enough, and she made a decision. She placed the basket, her basket, with her daughter in it, in the bassinet that had, the day before, held Margaret's lost child. She passed her hand over the baby's brow and laid down 2 blessings and 1 curse. The first blessing was magic, the kind that wizards have, channelable and trainable and bright. The second blessing was sight, the small, sharp ability to see what was actually in a room, regardless of what others insisted was there. The curse, and Hecate did consider it a curse, though she gave it because she had to, was longing. The child would grow up, the goddess knew, with a hollow place inside her where a divine parent ought to have stood, and that hollow place would whistle in any quiet weather, and the child would never quite be able to name what was missing. "Sleep, daughter," said Hecate, in a voice like a cat moving over old velvet. "Sleep and grow, and never let them put you on a shelf. I have given you what I can. You will be my hidden one. Stay hidden. There is safer weather there." Then she folded her cloak around herself and stepped out of the room, and the basket was just a bassinet again, and the nurse named Margaret Evans woke in the morning to a baby she did not remember bearing, and a love that did not understand why it was so sudden or so total. She named the baby Lily. 20 years later, in 1979, this same Lily, red-haired, 20 years old, sharp-tongued, a year out of Hogwarts and already quietly on 3 of Voldemort's lists, knelt in the rain by a grave in a cemetery in Cokeworth and tried to make sense of the death of her mother. Margaret Evans had been killed in a manner so ordinary that no version of the universe could comfortably absorb it. A drunk driver on a stretch of a road 3 miles out of town. 2 seconds of inattention. The hedgerow and the white car had folded together like a piece of paper. Petunia had identified the body, because Lily had been late getting in, and Lily had never quite forgiven herself for that. And Petunia, for her part, had never quite forgiven Lily for being late and never quite forgiven the world for being late, and they had not really spoken since the funeral. It was Lily now alone in the rain with a black umbrella that the wind kept trying to take from her, kneeling at the grave and trying to be the kind of person who comes back to graves. She had not heard him arrive. There had been no scrape of shoes on the gravel, no shift in the temperature of the air, no warning at all. There had only been, suddenly, a man standing on the opposite side of the headstone, in a long charcoal coat that fell in lines too still for the rain, with his hands in his pockets and his head tipped slightly down to read her mother's name. He was not tall exactly, although he gave the impression of being tall. He was not handsome exactly, although he gave the impression of being something more useful than handsome, which was unforgettable. His hair was very black, and his face was very pale, and his eyes were the color of wet slate, and the rain did not appear to be falling on him. It was falling around him. It was choosing. "Forgive the intrusion," said the man, in a voice that came up out of a deeper place than throats are supposed to reach. "I rarely visit gardens of this kind in daylight. They are louder than they look." Lily, who was a Gryffindor twice over and had been raised in a tough mill town and had once dueled Bellatrix Lestrange to a draw in a corridor outside Slughorn's office, said, "Get away from my mother's grave." The man inclined his head mildly and did not get away. "She is not here," he said after a moment. "If that is of any comfort, she is in a quieter precinct. The arrangement has been satisfactory. She is at peace." Lily stood up. The umbrella shook in her hand. "What did you say?" "I said," the man, and his slate eyes lifted to hers and held them with a courtesy so cold it felt almost like consideration, "that she is at peace. I would not have come otherwise. I would never insult a daughter of the threshold by visiting her in poor news." The word threshold, the way he said it, was not a word. It was a recognition. It went into Lily like a key into a lock that she had not known until that instant was in her chest. There was a soft, terrible click. The rain washed sideways against her face. "You know what I am," she said. It was not a question. It was the noise that a person makes when a hollow place she has been ignoring for 20 years suddenly speaks back. "I know what your mother is," said the man with a small, almost apologetic correction. "I know the goddess who left you on a Muggle doorstep in 1959. I know that she has not visited you since, and I know that you have felt that absence in a way you have learned to call by other names. Loneliness, restlessness, the wrong kind of magic, the right kind of magic at the wrong times. The sense, sometimes on certain evenings, that the room you have walked into is missing something it once had." He paused. Beneath his coat, his shoulders rose and fell as if he were breathing only out of politeness. "I am sorry to be the messenger of that information," he said. "Hecate is not unkind. She is overburdened. She decided when she put you in that basket that the safest thing she could give you was distance. I will not say she was wrong. I will only say that distance and absence are different shapes, and the difference is most clearly seen by the one being kept at a distance, which is to say, you." Lily, in the rain, in front of her mother's grave, in the worst week of her life, looked at the strange man across the headstone and said the only thing she could. "Who are you?" He smiled. It was, against all expectation, a small and tired and almost kind smile. "I am also overburdened," he said. "I am, in my own line of work, what your mother is in hers. I am called many names. The plainest of them is Hades." She did not, to her credit, faint. She did not, to her credit, run. She did set the umbrella down very carefully and let the rain fall on both of them and asked in a voice that did not entirely belong to her, "What do you want?" "To tell you," said Hades, "that your mother is well. To answer, if you wish, any questions she could not. And perhaps unforgivably, to sit somewhere out of this weather for an hour and listen to a daughter of the threshold speak, because it has been a very long time since I last sat with someone who could speak in that particular grammar without effort. There is a pub 3 streets from here. I do not need to eat or drink. I will buy you whatever you wish. I will leave the moment you ask me to." Lily looked at him for a long, long time. Later, in years she did not yet have, she would try to explain to herself what made her say yes. She would not be able to. She would settle in the end for the truth, which was that the worst week of her life had just become a week in which a god had told her she was the daughter of another god and offered her tea, and that there are some hours in some lives where the only sane thing to do is to take the tea. She nodded. He held out one charcoal-gloved hand, the way an older man at a country dance might hold out his hand to a girl who was not quite his partner, and after a moment she took it. The rain stepped sideways around both of them as they walked. The pub was called the Red Hare. Hades drank a half-pint of stout that did not appear to lower in the glass. Lily drank 3 cups of tea and ate a packet of crisps. She found, to her own ongoing astonishment, that she was not afraid of him. He was very still. He was very polite. He listened in a way that her professors at school had never listened, and her best friend had only sometimes, and her own dead mother had been too tired to. He answered when she asked what Hecate was and what she herself was, and what the strange sight had been all those years, and why the cat on the corner had always shown up before her mother did, and why she had known, at a flat distance in a separate room, the moment Margaret died. He answered other things she had not known to ask. He told her in passing what the Dark Lord she had been hearing about really was, and what the Dark Lord intended to make himself, and how that was a project, in his own professional opinion, that he, Hades, took an extremely dim view of, although he was not, he hastened to add, in the business of intervening unsolicited in mortal affairs. He told her about his realm, not the postcard version, the working one, the river that recorded oaths and the river that recorded grief and the river that recorded silence and the meadow where ordinary people went and the place that was not a meadow where people went who had been ordinary at other people's expense. He told her when she asked what he was doing in a graveyard in Cokeworth on a Tuesday afternoon. He had been, he said simply, paying his respects. Hades did not, as a rule, pay respects. Hades, as a rule, oversaw the transit of souls and prosecuted his accounts, and did not visit individual graves any more than a chief executive visited the desks of every employee. But Margaret Evans, he said, had taken in a child not her own in the autumn of 1959 and raised her and loved her, and had never asked the question that she had, very deep down, suspected she ought to ask, because she had decided that the love was more important than the question. Hades was the god of accounts. He had been on this particular Tuesday settling an account. Lily put her tea down. She did not cry. She had cried out by then. She said, "Thank you." He nodded once as if she had handed him something heavy. She did not know then that he had also been settling a different account, that he had, in fact, been watching her for years. Not in any predatory way. Gods of his particular office did not have predatory dispositions toward demigods, any more than a magistrate had predatory dispositions toward bailiffs. He had been watching because she was unusual, because Hecate's daughter, marrying into wizard blood and growing up in the world of wands, was, by his reckoning, a kind of bridge species he had not seen before. He was a god of certain useful curiosities. He had been waiting to see what she became. He did not tell her any of that yet. He did not tell her that night, because he was not a clumsy creature, and one did not lay claims on a daughter of the threshold in the same hour one introduced oneself to her. He did, before they parted, tell her this. There will come a night, Lily Evans, when you are asked to give the only thing that cannot be replaced. I will not warn you of it again. I will only say, when that night comes, the thing you give will not be wasted. I will see to that personally. She had thought that night that he meant her mother. She would later understand, much later, that he had meant her son. They did not, on that particular night, become anything to each other. He walked her to the gate of her mother's house, did not enter, bowed in a manner that was almost formal, and walked off down the road into a streetlight that flickered slightly and was, by the next blink, empty. They saw each other again, however, 3 more times over the year that followed. The first was at another graveyard, this one in Yorkshire, after Lily had attended the funeral of a school friend murdered by Death Eaters. He arrived as before, without announcement, with rain folding deferentially around him. He did not speak first. She did. She said, "Are you here on professional business?" And he said, "Yes." And then, after a moment, "And yours?" And she had nodded, and they had walked together for a while in silence. And he had told her, when they parted, the name of one of her friend's killers and where to find him, and she had not used that information for anything, but she had carried it in her pocket like a stone. The second was outside a hospital in London, after she had spent 40 hours fighting to save a Muggle child in a magical accident, and lost. Hades had been in the corridor when she came out. He had said only, "She is in the meadow, and it was not your failure." And Lily, who had not expected any of this to undo her, had sat down on the linoleum and cried into her own knees for 10 minutes while a god of the underworld stood very still and did not, by some courtesy known only to himself, leave. The third was Beltane. It was in a wood north of Inverness, where Lily had gone by herself for 2 nights of silence because she could no longer sleep in any building. Beltane. Hawthorn in bloom, the smell of cold smoke. A bonfire she had not lit, that nonetheless burned exactly where she meant a fire to burn, and a man in a charcoal coat sitting on a fallen tree beside it. He said, "I should not be here." She said, "I don't care." She would tell herself afterward every variant of every reason, that she had been grieving, that she had been 21 and full of war and full of fear of war and full of the part of her that was a goddess's daughter and had wanted just once to talk to someone who knew, that he had been older than the language she spoke, that he had been gentler than anyone had ever been to her. That the fire had not, in fact, been a fire at all, but a kind of warmth she had not realized she was allowed to want. None of the reasons quite covered it. It was one night. There were no promises. There were, more importantly, no demands. He left before dawn, the way the dignified always do, and she lay in the warmed grass and watched the sky turn gray with the precise, almost professional calm of a person who has just made a choice she will not be allowed to unmake. She thought then that she would never see him again. She did not. He was a god. He had limits, chiefly the limit of his own discretion. He kept it, but there were consequences. Hades, like Lily, was an honorable creature. He paid his debts. He did not, of course, send word. He waited instead in the quiet way that the dead wait, to see what the world would do with what he had given. By autumn, Lily knew. She told no one for 2 months. She told James first. James Potter had been in love with Lily Evans since he was approximately 12 years old, which is to say, ardently, badly, with a great deal of public humiliation, and with no real understanding of what he was in love with. By the time they were 17, however, he had mostly grown into it, quieter, steadier, with the cheerful courage of a boy who has put the worst of himself in a drawer and decided to leave it there. By the time they were 19, she loved him back. By 20, they were married. He was, in the autumn of 1980, 20 years old, an Auror's apprentice with a Patronus the size of a stag, a friend group consisting of the 4 most loyal men in Britain, and a wife who had been quiet for 2 months. He had not pressed. James was many things, but the thing he was perhaps most of late was patient about Lily. It was the only thing he had ever felt he could give her that nobody else also gave her. He had been waiting. She told him on a Friday, in their kitchen, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and her eyes fixed steadily on a small chip in the lip of the mug rather than on him. She told him the whole of it. Hecate the basket, the goddess of crossroads and magic, who her mother had really been. Then the graveyard, then Hades, then the wood at Beltane, then the child. When she was finished, she did not look up. She could not. James Potter sat for a long time in the kitchen of the house at Godric's Hollow, with his big, capable hands folded around his own mug and his glasses sliding very slightly down his nose. He breathed twice. He cleared his throat once. He said eventually in a very even voice that surprised even him, "Right." She looked up. He said, "Is the baby all right?" She said, "Yes, I think." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I don't know." He nodded. He took his glasses off. He set them on the table. He rubbed his face with both palms. Then he said the thing that, of all the things she had thought he might say, she had not in 12,000 rehearsals of this conversation imagined. He said, "Lily, look at me." She looked at him. He said, "He'll be my son." She started to cry. He said, "I know you. I know how you choose. I know what kind of man would have to be in a wood with you on Beltane for you to choose. I'm not afraid of him. I'm not even angry with him. I might one day be very angry with him, but I'll deal with that on my own time. Right now, on this Friday in our kitchen, I'm telling you that this baby is mine, the way you are mine, by choice. Do you understand?" She did not for a long minute understand. Then she did. She came around the table and he stood up, and she pressed her face into the front of his shirt and cried in a way that was not properly sadness. It was the noise that a person makes when she has spent 2 months expecting to lose everything and discovers she has not. He held her. He kissed the crown of her head. He said into her hair, quietly, "He'd better be brilliant at Quidditch, though, or this is all off." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 2 months. It sounded like a wet bell. It was settled, in the practical Potter way, by the morning. No one outside the 4 of them, James, Lily, and much later, Sirius and Remus, was ever told the truth. Wormtail was not told. Dumbledore was not told. The healers at St. Mungo's were not told. The Potter family lawyer was not told. The story was that he was James Potter's son. He was in every way that mattered for a child, James Potter's son. He was also, in the way that bound certain accounts in certain ledgers in certain palaces under the earth, the son of Hades. Both were true. He was born on the 31st of July, 1980, in a small private room at St. Mungo's, after 14 hours of labor that the senior midwife on duty would later describe to her own husband as perfectly ordinary, although there was a remarkable amount of static electricity, and at one point all the candles in the room went out at once, and I genuinely cannot explain it. James fainted, briefly. Sirius, in the waiting room, broke a chair by sheer celebration. Remus, more sober, brought tea. The baby was small and red and furious. He had a great deal of black hair. His eyes, when he opened them, were unmistakably Lily's, vivid green. They were also, though it took a careful observer to notice, slightly older than the eyes of an infant ought to be, not in any mystical sense. In the small, particular sense that they took, when they opened, a long, even look around the room before they closed again, as if accounting. Hades did not visit. Hades had said he would not. He kept his word, as he kept all his words. He sent a gift. 2 weeks after the birth, on a morning in mid-August, when James was at work and Lily was in the nursery rocking the baby and singing him a song her mother had sung her, there was, in the cradle, a small black stone she did not remember placing. It was not large. It was perfectly round and absolutely cold to the touch, and the kind of black that does not reflect light. It had been on the pillow beside the baby's cheek. She picked it up. The baby did not stir. The stone in her palm was no heavier than a marble. She knew, looking at it, what it was. She did not know the name. She knew the feeling. She slipped it into a velvet pouch that night and put it in a box at the back of her dresser drawer. She did not mention it to James. James, she felt, did not need to know about it. The boy would need it eventually. She would know when. She would not be alive to give it to him. The stone would survive her. Dumbledore would find it in the wreckage of the cottage and take it, mistaking it for something else, into his vault, where it would lie for nearly 17 years before another hand drew it out. But that is a much later chapter. They had 15 months. They were not, on the whole, peaceful months. There was a war. Voldemort was, day by day, making the world worse. The Order met in basements. James worked nights. Sirius and Remus came and went on missions. Lily was no longer well enough to run. There were prophecies and there were warnings, and there were 3 separate days on which they were told to expect the worst, and one day on which they actually had to defend the house with a knee-high baby in a sling, while Sirius hexed 2 Death Eaters off the front porch. In between all of that, however, there was a small dark-haired boy named Harry James Potter, who learned to laugh at 5 months, who learned to grab a finger and not let go at 6, who learned to roll over at 7, who would crawl, by 10, in the determined, swimming way of a baby on a mission, toward any source of light or warmth or his father's face. He was, in everyone's professional and unprofessional opinion, a perfectly ordinary baby. He was also, very occasionally, in a way that no one mentioned and no one quite knew how to mention, a baby who made certain things slightly cold. If he cried, the room would drop 2 or 3 degrees. If he was happy, the lights in the corridor would flicker as if pleased. Once, when Sirius had pretended to die on the rug for his amusement, Harry had laughed so hard that every pot plant in the sitting room had, faintly, dropped 1 petal each. There was, in the cellar, an old rat trap that did not catch rats. The rats simply walked around it. There were no mice on the property at all, although they were thick in the woods. Lily noticed. James noticed. They did not mostly say anything. They had decided long before that they would let him be exactly what he was, whatever that turned out to be. In the back of her drawer, the black stone sat in its pouch and did not get any warmer. On the 31st of October, 1981, at approximately 9:15 in the evening, the world ended in Godric's Hollow. It is not necessary to retell what happened to James. There are records, there are testimonies. He was unarmed and he was first, and he was the man he had always promised her he would be, which was the man who put himself between her and the door. He did not last very long. He was 21. There is, however, something to be said about what happened to Lily, because the wizarding histories have got most of it wrong. She did beg, that is true. Voldemort did offer her life briefly, because Severus Snape had asked him to. That is also true. She did refuse, because she was, after 21 years on this earth, exactly the person Hecate had thought she might be, and she chose her son. The histories say she stepped in front of the curse and absorbed it, and that her love anchored an ancient blood magic that protected the boy. That was half of what happened. The other half, in the half-second before the green light left Voldemort's wand and reached her, Lily, who knew, by then, every name of every river she had been told about in a wood north of Inverness, looked over her shoulder at her son in the crib and said very quietly, because she had so little time and there was only the one thing left to say, "My lord, your son, take him up." It was not a prayer. It was an invocation by right. A daughter of the threshold, freely and knowingly, claiming a service from a god to whom she had given a son. Hades, in his palace, in the room he kept for matters that pertained to his line, looked up from a 13th century ledger of doges. He stood. He walked in his unhurried way to the surface. He was not in time to save her. He had never said he would be. She had not asked him to. He had asked her only to take up the boy. The killing curse struck Lily Evans, daughter of Hecate, wife of James Potter, mother of Harry, and she fell. There was in that fall a flash of green of 2 distinct shades. There was the green of Voldemort's spell. There was, finer and colder, the green of demigod blood lit by death magic, the particular green of certain torch flames that burn on the shore of the river that recorded oaths. The 2 colors met on her body and did not blend. They argued. The argument, contained within Lily's flesh in the millisecond before she became wholly dead, ricocheted upward. Some of it left the cottage as light. Some of it went sideways through the crib into the small boy who was lying there, into the place behind his forehead, where, by all the customary maps, no spell ought to have been able to reach. The killing curse hit him. It rebounded. Voldemort's body shredded. The roof took most of the shockwave. The wards he had broken to enter the house also broke under him on the way out. He was, by every wizarding metric, dead. But that, again, is only half of it. In the other half, in the room where the lights had failed and the cot stood smoking, and the small boy lay with a fresh red wound the shape of a small lightning across his forehead, Hades arrived. He arrived not as a man this time. He arrived as a long, narrow shadow that bent at the wall and slid across the floor like a spilled inkwell. He bent over the cot. The shadow lengthened, narrowed, became, for a half-second, the precise shape of a tall man with his head bowed. The baby, who had been screaming, stopped. The shadow laid one long, cool hand on his forehead. The wound did not heal. It was, by Hades's own assessment, a wound that ought to remain. Wounds of that grade, in his professional view, were the kind that taught. But the shadow took the green light out of it. Almost, most of it. A piece, lodged so deep that even Hades could not reach without taking the child himself, was left where it was. Hades looked at the splinter of soul that had become lodged behind the small boy's scar, a fragment of Voldemort screaming silently, and did, without any expression whatsoever, a thing that has never been written in any wizarding text. He filed it. He did not destroy it. He did not eject it. He noted it, he sealed it down to the floor of the boy's skull, where it could be retrieved, and he turned mentally to the question of where the remaining 6 fragments were. He would, he decided, take his time. He had time. He had all of it. He bent then to the dead woman on the floor. He did not move her. He did not raise her. He said in the language that had been spoken in his palace for 40 centuries 3 words. The translation runs roughly, I have him. Then the shadow looked once at the boy in the cot. Sleep, Harry, it said, in something that was very nearly a voice. You will not remember this. You will, however, remember that you were loved, both kinds of love. Both kinds will be true. I will see you in dreams. The shadow rose, narrowed, became smoke, and was gone. Hagrid, who had been 30 miles away when Sirius's Patronus had reached him, arrived 2.5 hours later. He found the dead, and he found the boy, and he wrapped the boy in his enormous coat and held him. The boy did not cry. The boy, in fact, was unnervingly calm. Hagrid, who had cried for his own mother into the same enormous coat the day she died, would tell McGonagall, much later, that the baby in his arms had looked up at him with eyes that he, Hagrid, had not been ready for. It were like, pardon me, headmaster, it were like he were old, just for a second, just look in. Old as the hills, he had paused, and then he were a baby again, just a baby, crying for his mum. McGonagall had said nothing. Dumbledore had said nothing. They had bundled the baby into a car and taken him by the route the history's record to Privet Drive and laid him on a doorstep at 4 in the morning with a letter. The letter did not mention Hecate because Dumbledore did not know. The letter did not mention Hades because Dumbledore did not know. But Petunia Dursley, who had hated her sister for many things and loved her for many more, opened the door at 6 a.m., looked down at the small dark-haired boy on her doormat, and said one word aloud into the very cold morning air. The word was, oh. She knelt slowly. She picked up the bundle. The baby's eyes opened. They were very green. They were also, the way Hagrid had seen, briefly the eyes of someone much older, who was registering for the record where he had been delivered and by whom. Petunia looked down into those eyes and said, very softly, with a precision that had taken her whole life to achieve, I know what you are, lad. I knew what your mother was. Lord help us both. She carried him inside. Behind her, on the doormat, the shadow of the doorframe lay across the welcome rug at an angle that the rising sun did not justify. The shadow was longer than the doorframe. It paused there for a moment, as if reading the house. Then it withdrew slowly around the corner of the porch and was gone. The Lord of the Pit had personally walked his son to the door. He had nowhere else to be that morning, and nowhere else he would rather have been. Chapter 2: The Woman Who Knew, the Man Who Did Not, and the Birds in the Flower Bed. For nearly a decade afterward, the house at number 4 Privet Drive contained 2 kinds of silence and 1 kind of noise. The noise was Vernon. Vernon Dursley filled rooms the way bad weather fills a window. He was loud in the particular British way of men who are not, fundamentally, in charge of anything in their own lives, and therefore intend to be very much in charge of the small kingdom of the rumpus room and the breakfast table. He commented on news he had not read. He commented on people he had not met. He told stories about the office in which he was always, in the climactic moment, the man who had spoken sense. He was in his own house, the great roar of the appliances. The first silence was Petunia's silence. It was not, on inspection, a single silence. It was a layered one, the sort of silence that has had practice. There was the surface silence she presented to Vernon, which was a wifely silence, agreeing and laughing at the right moments. There was the silence she carried into the church on Sundays, which was prim and pointed and addressed itself to the women in the next pew. There was the silence she kept up over the garden fence with Mrs. Number 6, which was a competitive silence about hedge heights and the wrong sort of shoes. And then there was the silence underneath all of them, the deep one, the one Petunia kept locked, the one that knew. The second silence was Harry's silence. It was the kind of silence small boys learn to grow in cupboards. He was, by Hades's appointment as well as by an accident of geography, the strangest child in Little Winging. Petunia knew, on the morning Hagrid put the bundle on her doormat, 3 things she had never told Vernon and did not intend to. She knew first that her sister was not entirely her sister. Margaret Evans had told her on her deathbed the truth as Margaret understood it, that Lily had been a foundling, brought in the autumn of 1959, taken in by Margaret out of grief, raised as her own and never told. Margaret had been weeping when she told her. Margaret had said, "I should have told her, Toonie. I should have told her when she was old enough. I never knew the right time. I never knew if she'd hate me. I never knew if she'd love me less." Petunia in that hospital room had been 26 years old and recently and tightly married to Vernon and recently and bitterly estranged from her sister, and she had said evenly, "She wouldn't have loved you less, Mum. She loved you all the way down." She had also said, after a long pause, "I won't tell her," and she had not. Lily had died not knowing the part of her own life that was on the cover, but Petunia had read certain books in the years that followed. She had grown up next to a witch. After all, she had developed, in self-defense, a certain practical literacy in the things that wizards refused to be plain about. She had taken out, from a strange little shop near Charing Cross that she would never tell anyone she had visited, 3 books on the subject of foundlings and the older bloodlines. She had read them in the bath, with the door locked, with Vernon snoring through the wall. She had put them, when she was done, in a hat box at the back of her wardrobe, behind her wedding shoes. She knew, by the time she was 30, what Lily probably was. She knew the word demigod. She knew the word Hecate. She did not, until the night she opened the door to the bundle, know the word Hades, but she had read enough to recognize the shadow that had pooled on her welcome mat that morning, and she had read enough to know that one did not say no to that shadow's request, and she had read enough to know that the small boy in the bundle was, whatever else he was, not the kind of boy you put in a cupboard for very long without consequences. The third thing she knew was the one she could not bring herself to think about during daylight. Petunia, all those years ago, had once gone with Lily to a fair in Cokeworth. The summer Lily was 11 and Petunia was 14, and a fortune-teller in a red tent had taken one look at the 2 girls and said to Petunia very quietly, "Watch over her, child, watch over her always. There are gods at her elbow even now." And Petunia, 14 and jealous and unkind, had said, "I'm not watching anything." And the fortune-teller had said, "You will not be able to help it." Watch the boy too, and Petunia had left the tent in a temper, and Lily had eaten candy floss and not noticed anything was the matter. The boy, the fortune-teller had said the boy, decades before there was a boy. Petunia did not think about that mostly. There were dishes to do, but when she opened her front door at 6 a.m. that November morning in 1981 and looked down at Harry and his bundle and met those particular green eyes, she knew, in the deepest of her silences, that she had been waiting for him. She also knew that Vernon could never, ever know. If Vernon knew that the boy on the doormat was a half-blood son of a Greek god, Vernon would, by Petunia's careful estimate, do exactly 2 things. He would have a heart attack, and then, when he got out of hospital, he would do something stupid. Vernon could be relied upon, when in doubt, to do something stupid. It was one of the great steady comforts of being married to him. It was, also, one of the great steady dangers. So Petunia, who was many things and not all of them generous, made a hard pragmatic decision in her own kitchen at 6:30 in the morning on the 1st of November, 1981, while Vernon was still snoring and Dudley was wedged in his high chair with a rusk. She would raise the boy in the cupboard, and she would never tell Vernon what he was, and she would, when nobody was watching her, watch him and watch over him, and try, in the small careful ways available to a woman who had not been built for this, to keep certain doors in him from opening too soon. She did not love him, she would have to live with that. She loved Lily dead and unforgiven and unreachable, and she loved Lily so much it was a kind of permanent toothache, and she could not transfer that love to the small dark-haired boy on her sofa, because to do so would be to admit she had lost her sister, and Petunia Dursley had been refusing to admit losses since she was 8 years old. But she would watch him. She would not let him be killed. She would not let him be taken. She would not, when the time came, lie to him about what he had really been. She would lie to him about everything else. She thought this that morning in the kitchen, with the tea brewing and Vernon snoring upstairs, and she did not realize that she had just had the most clear-eyed thought of her adult life, and that it was now, for the rest of her life, going to govern her in ways she had never wanted to be governed. She poured herself another cup of tea. She picked the boy up. He weighed almost nothing. He was looking at her with a very steady old gaze. "You don't make me lie to him about the other things, lad," she said, very quietly, to him alone. You don't make me lie to him about love or about people being unkind to him or about anything anyone owes him. I will lie about those if I must. But you don't make me, do you understand? I am sorry. I am sorrier than I will ever tell you. Now hush, your uncle's coming downstairs." The boy did not hush, but he did not cry either. He simply kept looking at her with that long, accounting look, the way his shadow father had looked at Margaret Evans's headstone in the rain. Petunia, who had not crossed herself since her own first communion, crossed herself once, very fast, and tucked the boy under her arm and went to make Vernon's tea. The first manifestation Petunia could not pretend she had not seen happened when Harry was 3. He was, by that age, already living in the cupboard under the stairs. Dudley, who had taken to him with the cheerful curiosity of a much larger animal investigating a smaller one, had at some point during babyhood transitioned to a frank and ongoing dislike, which was less about Harry himself than about the fact that Dudley had been promised, by his mother and father both, that he was the king of the house, and Harry, small, quiet, dark, was visibly not a subject. Dudley resented this. Dudley took it out mostly in shoves and stolen biscuits, and by the age of 5, the elaborate game called Harry hunting, which involved getting the other neighborhood boys to chase Harry until somebody fell over. Vernon was loudly oblivious, in the way that gave his own obliviousness moral weight. Petunia was quietly aware. But before any of that, when Harry was 3 and small enough that his name had not yet calcified in Vernon's mind into the syllable spat the way one might spit out an olive pit, when he was still just the boy, interchangeable with the cat or the milkman, an annoyance but not yet a target, Petunia had taken him out into the garden with a wooden bowl of peas to shell. It was June. The sweet peas she had planted were just coming up. The wisteria over the kitchen window was in its second flush of bloom. Harry, in the careful little smock she had cut down for him from one of Dudley's old shirts, had been sitting on the lawn with the bowl between his knees and shelling peas with the exquisite attention small children reserve for tasks no one has demanded of them. A blackbird had landed on the lawn near him. Harry had looked at it. The blackbird had looked at Harry. "Hello," said Harry with great formality. "TK," said the blackbird in the way of blackbirds. There was a moment. The blackbird, in the manner of birds in those days in those gardens, was a small, glossy creature, neat in itself and busy with its own business. It hopped twice toward Harry. Harry, very seriously, put one shelled pea on the grass between them. The blackbird, after a pause, took the pea and flew off. Harry laughed. It was the soft, surprised laugh of a child who has just been included in a transaction he had not known was available to him. He looked over his shoulder at his aunt, who was on the back step pretending not to be watching, and gave her, briefly, a smile so unguarded that Petunia, 15 feet away, with the kitchen towel still in her hand, felt a thing happen in her chest that she did not have a name for and did not want to. She turned her back on it very quickly and went into the kitchen. That was the morning. The blackbird came back with 2 friends in the afternoon. Harry, now installed with a coloring book on the back step, fed them peas from his pocket. The blackbird made a slow, careful loop around his head and landed on his shoe. Harry sat absolutely still, as a child does when blessed by something he does not believe he is allowed to scare. Petunia, watching this through the kitchen window, said aloud to no one, "It's the eyes, it's the look in his eyes." She did not, in that moment, know what she meant by it. That night, Mrs. No. 2's cat got into the back garden, which was not unusual. But on this particular night it caught, with the silent professional violence of cats, all 3 of the blackbirds. The cat then, having dispatched the birds, did the unusual thing of laying them on the back step in a neat row, side by side, the way a cat is sometimes said to do when offering a tribute to a person it has decided to acknowledge as a god. Petunia found them in the morning. She buried them quietly under the wisteria before anyone else was awake. It was, by the look of them, accidental. There was nothing unusual in the back garden. There were no shadows. There were no signs. But Harry, 3 years old and asleep in the cupboard under the stairs, was, at the moment Petunia knelt by the wisteria with the trowel, weeping in his sleep without making any noise. She did not know that, of course. Petunia did not visit the cupboard at night. Nobody did. There was nothing to see. But the next morning, when Harry came out of the cupboard for his breakfast, his eyes were red, and he did not eat, and he sat on the step for a long time looking at the patch of disturbed earth under the wisteria. He looked in particular at the earth. He was 3, Petunia had to remind herself. 3, he was 3. "What are you looking at, Harry?" she said sharply, because the sharpness was easier than the question underneath. Harry did not look at her. He kept looking at the earth. "They moved," he said simply. "What did?" "They moved," he said again. "I told them to." Petunia stood in her doorway with the kitchen towel and looked at the patch of wisteria. The earth, when she had filled it in over the dead blackbirds, had been smooth. It was now faintly mounded. There was a small black feather lying loose on top, exactly in the center, as if it had been placed there. She felt a thing in her stomach that she had felt only twice before in her life. Once when Margaret died, and once on the doorstep in November of 1981. She said, in a voice she was proud of for being level, "Did you go outside last night?" "No," said Harry, who at 3 was incapable of lying. "Did you ask anyone to do anything for you in the garden?" He thought about this. He was, even at 3, a small, careful thinker. He nodded. She knelt down on the back step. She made herself look at him. He had the look of a small boy who had done a thing he was not fully sure he had been allowed to do. She said very softly, "Who did you ask, Harry?" He looked at his shoes. "The man in the corner," he said. She did not move. The kitchen towel did not move. The morning birds did not, for a small held second, sing. "What man, Harry?" He looked up at her, and his green eyes were very serious, and he said with the simple, terrible candor of small children, "He visits me in the cupboard. When it's dark, he's nice. He has the same eyes as me sometimes. He says he's my other father." Petunia put one hand on the step to steady herself. She made herself, with effort, not look afraid. "What did you ask him, Harry?" "To make the birds not be dead," said Harry. "I thought maybe I was bad. I thought maybe the cat got them because I fed them my peas and they shouldn't have been so close. He said it wasn't my fault. He said the cat was just a cat. He said he wouldn't make them be alive again because that wasn't allowed. But he could make them sort of awake, so I could say sorry. So I said sorry, and then he made them go to sleep again. He said it was just for me. He said next time I should ask him sooner when something is hurting and he would come." Petunia did not, to her credit, scream. She knelt and she took her nephew's small hand in hers, for the first time, in fact, that she had ever voluntarily taken his hand. She held it. She said in her most even surly voice, "Harry, love, listen to me. The man in the corner is real. I'm not going to tell you he isn't, but he is secret. He is a very, very big secret. You do not tell anyone about him, not the boys at nursery, not Aunt Marge when she comes, most especially not Uncle Vernon. Do you understand? Not because he is bad, because Uncle Vernon would not understand. He would be afraid. And when Uncle Vernon is afraid, the world becomes much harder, for everyone, including you. Do you understand?" Harry, who at 3 had not understood most of what she had just said, nodded gravely anyway, because there are some questions an adult asks where the only correct answer from a child is yes. She squeezed his hand once. She let it go. She stood up. "Eat your toast," she said in her ordinary voice, and she went inside. He ate his toast. He did not, for the rest of his childhood, mention the man in the corner to Vernon. He kept the secret with the small, grave competence of a child who has been given a real one. Petunia, when she was back in the kitchen, leaned against the door for a long moment with one hand pressed flat to her sternum, and breathed in twice and breathed out twice, and reminded herself why she was doing what she was doing. The wisteria that summer bloomed unseasonably long. For the next 4 years, the manifestations were small, but Petunia logged them all, in her own private way. She kept the log in her head. She had no diary. She did not, on principle, write down anything that could be found by Vernon or by his sister Marge. In her head she kept the list. Age 4 March. Harry, sitting in the bath, made the water around him cold in a perfect circle while leaving the water around Petunia, kneeling at the side, lukewarm. She said nothing. She washed his hair. He had been frightened, she realized later, by something she had said sharply about Lily. He had not even known the name. He had only known the temperature of his aunt's voice. The water had defended him. Age 4, October. A boy at the church-attached nursery had been pulling Harry's hair. Petunia had gone to collect him to discover that the boy in question had been found, 10 minutes earlier, hiding in the cloakroom, claiming that the dark on the floor had been looking at him. There were no shadows in the cloakroom that should have been looking at anything. The boy did not pull Harry's hair again. The boy, indeed, would not look at Harry for the rest of nursery. Age 5, July. Aunt Marge visited with her bulldog Ripper. Ripper, who had bitten 3 postmen and a child, on entering the front room and seeing Harry on the rug, turned in a complete circle, tucked his tail, urinated on the carpet, and bolted under the sideboard, where he stayed for the entire visit. Marge, who had never been spoken to in this way by one of her own dogs, blamed Harry. Harry had not done anything to the dog. Harry had, in fact, never had any interest in dogs at all, which Petunia found, in retrospect, the strangest of all the small signs. He did not like them. He did not approach them. He did not even, that afternoon, look at Ripper. But Ripper had looked at Harry once, with the small, terrible accuracy of dogs who have an opinion, and Ripper had recognized something at the bottom of the boy that the bulldog's tiny good heart did not want to be in a room with. Age 5, August. The hibiscus in the front garden, which Petunia had been trying to coax through a 3rd year and had nearly given up on, bloomed all at once in a single morning, on the day Harry was allowed, briefly, by Vernon's accidental absence to play in the front yard. He had walked past the hibiscus on his way to the gate. 20 minutes later, the entire plant was in flower. Petunia counted 47 blooms. She did not tell Vernon, who would have decided the hibiscus was dying and pulled it out. Age 6, June. A pigeon flew into the kitchen window and broke its neck. Harry, who had been at the table doing a long division worksheet because Petunia, secretly, did extra schooling with him while Vernon was at the office and Dudley was at football camp, had said without looking up, "It's all right, Aunt Petunia. He says it didn't hurt. He says it was very quick. He says I shouldn't be sad." Petunia, who had been about to scrape the pigeon off the windowsill with the dustpan, had said without turning, "Who is he, Harry?" "You know," Harry had said. "The man in the corner." She had said nothing. She had scraped the pigeon. She had put it decently in a paper bag. She had buried it in the side bed beside the wisteria. She had washed her hands twice. She had given Harry a biscuit. She had not that night slept very well. Age 7, January. The cat from number 2, the one that had killed the blackbirds, was found on Petunia's doorstep, dead with no sign of injury. Petunia, opening the door to find it, looked down for a long moment. The cat's eyes were closed. The cat had been arranged in a circle, its tail in its mouth, the way a child draws a sleeping animal in a picture book. There was a small black feather on its paws. Petunia, very carefully, lifted the cat into a shoebox. She walked it down to Mrs. Number 2's house and rang the bell, and explained with the perfect blandness of a Surrey wife that the poor creature seemed to have died of natural causes on her doorstep, and she had wanted to bring it home rather than disturb its rest. Mrs. Number 2 had wept. Petunia had been brisk and kind. Petunia had returned home, gone into the cupboard under the stairs, and looked at her nephew, who was 7 and had not done anything wrong, who was reading a library book about the constellations under a torch. She had said very quietly, "Harry." "Yes, Aunt Petunia. Did you ask the man in the corner about the cat next door?" He looked up at her. He was learning by then to give her the truth without giving her too much of it. He said after a small thinking moment, "I told him I was sad about the blackbirds. He said the cat had a long life and was very old. He said it was its time. He said he would do it kindly. I said all right. I asked if it was all right that I said all right. He said it was." Petunia closed her eyes. She put one hand on the doorframe of the cupboard. She said, "Harry, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You did not do anything wrong. You did not. Do you hear me? You are not a bad boy. You did not kill the cat. The man in the corner did. He did it kindly. Probably the cat was indeed old. But Harry, listen, you must not ask him to take away things that are bothering you, even if they are unkind things, even if they are cats that have killed blackbirds or boys who have pushed you on the playground or anyone at all. Do you understand? You must not ask him. He will not refuse you. He has a soft spot, for you in particular, and you are 7 and you do not yet know what should be asked for and what should not. Do you understand?" He did not fully. He nodded anyway. He said after a moment, "He told me that too. He told me I had to be very careful what I asked him. He said death was his to give, not mine. He said most things I would want were not death. He said he would help me with anything else, but he said I had to learn the difference." Petunia opened her eyes. She looked at her 7-year-old nephew, who at that moment was sitting in a cupboard under a staircase, in the dim light of a torch on a folded gray blanket, with a library book about constellations on his knees, with a small old gravity in his green eyes that did not belong to a 7-year-old. She knelt. She did not exactly hug him. That was not in her repertoire. She put one hand carefully on his small shoulder. She said, "You'll learn the difference, lad. He'll teach you. I will teach you what I can in the things I know. You are not bad. You will not be bad. I am sorry I cannot tell you more. I am sorry I cannot tell you much. Some of this you will have to find on your own. But you are not bad. Do you hear me? You are not bad." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the simple, unguarded courage of a small child who is not very often touched on purpose, he said, "You don't have to be sorry, Aunt Petunia. I think I knew already. I think he told me." She let go of his shoulder. She stood up. She closed the cupboard door. She went upstairs and locked herself in the bathroom and ran the cold tap and cried for a quarter of an hour without making any sound, into the towel. Then she came down and made Vernon's dinner. Vernon never noticed any of it. This was not contrary to the family histories because Vernon was stupid. Vernon was not in any technical sense stupid. He was sufficient to his life. He had a job which he did adequately. He had a wife whom he treated with the affectionate property rights of a Surrey husband. He had a son whom he loved without nuance. He had a house which he was paying down. He had a hedge which he kept trimmed. He had a car which he washed on Sundays. He had a routine, and he had, in his routine, an immense and unshakable confidence in the rightness of his own life. He never noticed because nobody who had decided what reality was in advance could be told otherwise except by being shouted at, and nobody in the house was shouting at Vernon about anything other than his cholesterol. He noticed that the boy was sullen. He noticed that the boy ate, in his opinion, too much for someone who contributed nothing. He noticed that the boy was odd. He noticed that the boy made him, for reasons Vernon could not name, very tired. He did not notice that the boy fed crows from the back step in the early morning, or that the dog from number 6 had stopped going past the front fence, or that the blackbirds had returned and had multiplied and had, for some seasons, formed a small loyal flock that lived in the elder tree at the back of the garden and were never preyed on by anything. He did notice on one occasion, when Harry was 8, that the boy was talking to someone in the dark of the cupboard under the stairs at 2:30 in the morning, while Vernon was on his way to the kitchen to find a glass of water and an antacid. Vernon paused, briefly, with his hand on the banister. He listened. Harry's voice, low and serious, was saying, "But why, though?" There was a silence. Then Harry's voice again, fainter, sleepy. "All right, I'll try, I love you." Then nothing. Vernon stood at the bottom of the stairs for a few seconds. He considered opening the cupboard door. He considered the option for perhaps 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, the corridor of the Dursley house grew very, very slightly colder, and the photographs on the wall, the wedding photographs and the Dudley photographs and the holiday photographs at Cornwall, turned all at once by an angle no greater than 2 degrees, away from the cupboard, away from him, so subtly that he would never have noticed except that he had been about to step toward them. He did not open the cupboard. He went and got his glass of water. He took 2 antacids. He went back to bed. He never afterward thought about it. The next morning, the photographs were straight. Vernon Dursley, in his entire life, was never even slightly aware that he had been, one night, in a corridor of his own house, very politely warned off by the husband of his sister-in-law. By the time Harry was 8 years old, 3 things were quietly true. 1. Petunia Dursley loved him. She had not in any 12-month intended to. She had not, even now, admitted it to herself. But she loved him in the careful underground way of women whose love is not allowed to come up into the light. She fed him slightly more than Vernon authorized. She mended his 2 large hand-me-downs with stitches that were a kind of language. She had begun, the previous winter, taking him to the library on Tuesdays when she did the shopping, because the library was the kind of place where a small odd boy could disappear into the stacks and be left in peace for 2 hours, and she had noticed that he came out of those hours with his shoulders down for the only time in the week. 2. He was teaching himself, with a torch under a blanket, things that no living Muggle could have taught him. He had by 8 sounded out his way through 3 books on the constellations, 2 books on Greek mythology, chosen, on a hunch he could not have explained, from the 8 to 10 shelf at the library, and 1 book on dogs with diagrams. 3. The man in the corner had begun, in his courteous, unhurried way, to prepare him for a thing they had not yet given a name to. 2 nights a week in the cupboard in the dark, Harry James Potter was being taught by his shadow father the small basic grammar of what it meant to be a son of Hades. Lessons in stillness, lessons in seeing, lessons in listening, lessons in not being seen, lessons, occasionally, in the kind of breathing that was older than oxygen. He was being raised, in other words, by 3 people, and only 2 of them lived in the house. The third visited at night. The third had, in his entire long divine career, never raised a child before, and was making certain quiet small decisions about how to do it that no other god of his line had ever made. He was teaching him to be kind. He was teaching him to be careful. He was teaching him, above all, that none of what was inside him gave him the right to hurt anyone who had not earned it, and that even the people who had earned it sometimes had to be left alone. Hades in the cupboard under the stairs at number 4 Privet Drive was learning, with great care, how to be a father. The boy, with great care, was learning how to be his. Chapter 3, Mr. Cuddles, the first hellhound came on a Wednesday. This is, in the long history of hellhounds and the boys who acquire them, an unusually domestic detail, but it is, in Harry's life, the kind of detail that mattered. Wednesdays at Privet Drive were small. Vernon was at work and complaining about traffic. Dudley was at school and bullying a child named Piers Palkis. Petunia was at the shops. The house was Harry's, briefly, from approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, when he came home from his own school, until approximately 5:45, when his aunt would return with bags from Marks and Spencer, and the radio would come on, and the kitchen would smell of onions, and the working day would resume. Harry, who was 7¾ years old on the Wednesday in question, had used these brief solitary hours, all that autumn, to sit in the back garden on the rug square Petunia had quietly left out for him, and to do, in the careful semi-private way of his life, two things at once. He was ostensibly doing his maths homework. He was, in fact, listening to his shadow father. Hades did not exactly come to him in daylight. The rules of the visit had never been spelled out, because Hades, like Petunia, was a creature who preferred to leave the rules of important things implicit, but Harry had picked them up by attentive osmosis. Daylight visits were possible only in places of certain kinds: graveyards, abandoned buildings, the dim ferns under the old elder tree at the back of the garden, the small spot behind the lilac where the shadow lay on the lawn even at noon. They were brief, they were rare, they were business. Night visits, by contrast, proper visits in the cupboard, or on warm nights when Harry was allowed by Petunia's quiet defiance to sleep with the cupboard door open, were long and slow, and the way fathers were supposed to be with sons. On the Wednesday in question, however, his shadow father had come in daylight. He had come in the shape of a long, particular darkness at the foot of the lilac, the kind of darkness that did not so much arrive as decide to be noticed. "Harry," said the darkness, in that voice that came up out of a deeper place than throats. "Yes, father," said Harry, without looking up from his exercise book, because they had agreed, very early in their acquaintance, that turning around suddenly to face the lilac would only attract Mrs. Number 6's attention over the fence. "You are nearly 8, said the shadow. "Yes, father, and it is time," said the shadow, "for you to have a friend." Harry, who had been working out the long division remainder for a problem involving the cost of buying 11 oranges, set his pencil down very carefully on the page. He looked sidelong at the lilac. "A friend, father," he said. It was not a question. It was a verification. He had learned that gods, when they spoke in plain words, sometimes meant exactly the plain word and sometimes meant a great deal more, and the right thing to do was to verify gently. "A friend," said the shadow. "What sort of friend, father?" Still sidelong, still polite, the shadow in the corner of his vision did a thing he had not seen it do before. It quivered. It was, Harry would understand in his much older years, the way Hades's shoulders moved when Hades was, very privately, amused. "A useful sort," said the shadow. "Will Aunt Petunia like him, father?" The shadow considered. Eventually, cautiously, "Will Uncle Vernon like him, father?" "Uncle Vernon is not to meet him, not for several years. You will see to that. You are already very good at making your business invisible. You will be better." "Yes, father, father." "Yes, Harry." "Will he be a person?" There was a small silence. The shadow seemed to settle, the way an old man settles before an answer he has been looking forward to. "No," said the shadow, "he will be a dog. Or a thing very like a dog. He will be technically a puppy of a creature called a hellhound. There are not many of them on the surface, and there are not many of them tame, and the only ones in either category at any one time generally are mine. I will give you one of mine. He is yours, Harry. He has in fact been yours since the moment you were born. I have been keeping him for you. He is becoming impatient, Harry. He has asked in his own way for some time to come up." Harry looked very steadily now at the shape of darkness in the lilac. He was a small boy. He had not, in his small life, ever had anything that was his. His shoes were Dudley's old shoes. His shirts were Dudley's old shirts. The torch he read by under his blanket was a torch he had taken from a drawer in the kitchen. The gray blanket in the cupboard was the blanket Petunia had been about to throw out. The library books he had borrowed and returned. There had not been, in the 7 years and 10 months of his life, a single object or animal or person about whom he was permitted to use the word mine without immediate contradiction. He said in a voice he did not recognize, "Mine, father, yours, Harry." The silence that followed was not, on the surface, a long one. It was perhaps 3 seconds. But inside it, the small boy on the rug square went, very privately, through a process that Hades, in his palace under the earth, watched without speaking. Harry considered the word. He considered what he would be allowed to do with it. He considered, even briefly, whether he ought to ask his shadow father to take the gift back, on the grounds that he was not, perhaps, the kind of boy who was allowed to have a thing of his own. He considered whether possessing the friend would be a thing that would hurt other people. He considered last, with the careful, neat ethics of a 7-year-old who had been raised, in great part, by a god of accounts, what the friend would want. He looked up at the lilac. "Will he be happy with me, father?" The shadow was quiet for a long moment. Then, in the voice his shadow father used only very rarely, the voice that was not a god voice but a smaller, older, kinder voice that Harry, in the privacy of his own mind, knew by no name except Dad, Hades said, "Harry, he will be the happiest creature on the surface of this earth. He has been waiting in my house, in the kennels by the river that records oaths, since the night you were born. He has watched you when permitted in his sleep. He knows your name. He knows your voice. He has, on his own initiative, with no encouragement from me whatsoever, learned the entire layout of this garden by sniffing, in dreams, the boots his sisters bring back from your house when they visit. He will tear out, with great cheerfulness, the throat of anything that ever raises a hand against you. He will also, almost more importantly, lay his enormous head on your lap and snore. I cannot quite tell you how much he has wanted to come. Harry, sitting on his rug square, with his pencil on his maths book and the autumn light coming through the lilac, was very small for a long second. Then he said, quietly, "Please send him up, Father." The shadow moved. It is hard to describe what happened next, but Harry would remember it for the rest of his life, and would not, in any of the retellings, quite manage to describe it either. The shadow at the foot of the lilac pool deepened, narrowed. The autumn light around it did not change. The hedge did not move. There was no sound. There was only a small black shape on the rug square. It was the size of a very small puppy. It was perhaps the size of two of Harry's hands cupped together. It had short, dense, charcoal black fur, the kind that did not catch the light. It had a small wet nose and 4 small clumsy paws and a long, thin tail that was already, even before it opened its eyes, attempting to wag. And then it opened its eyes. They were red. They were not, Harry noticed immediately, the red of stoplights or fairy tale wolves or anything cartoonish. They were the red of the embers at the bottom of a fire that had been very large and was now mostly memory. They were warm. They were intelligent. They were, the moment they focused on Harry, the eyes of a creature that had been waiting a very long time and was, now, at last, looking at the only thing in the world it had ever wanted to look at. The small black puppy on the rug square took, with enormous and clumsy effort, one trembling step toward Harry, then another. Then it tried for a third and overbalanced and fell face first onto Harry's exercise book. Its small wet nose smeared the long division on number 11. Harry, who at 7 3/4 had not yet been told that he was allowed to laugh aloud in his aunt's garden, laughed. The puppy lifted its head from the exercise book. It looked up at him. The red embers in its eyes were full of a small, terrible, patient love. It opened its small mouth, exposed a long pink tongue, and licked Harry's wrist. Harry, very carefully, picked the puppy up. It was warm. Warmer than the autumn day around them. It smelled, faintly, of wood smoke. It made in his hands a small grunting sigh that was not a sigh any earthly puppy had ever made, and Harry knew at once, with the certainty small children have about the things that are theirs, that this small black warm grunting creature was his and that he was its. He bent his face to the puppy's small head. He whispered into its small soft black ear the sentence he had been working out, in his own private boyish way, all the long afternoons of his unloved childhood, for a moment exactly like this one. "Hello, Mr. Cuddles. I'm Harry. We're going to be all right now." In the lilac, the shadow watched and was still, and was, though he did not, of course, allow it to register on the official records of his realm, perhaps the happiest he had been in 900 years. The first problem was hiding him. Petunia was due back from the shops in 40 minutes. Vernon was due back from the office in 2 hours. Dudley would be home from Piers Polkis's house, where he had been playing but had in fact been kicking the Polkis family cat, in 3 hours. Marge was not, thank every god there was, due to visit. Harry sat with the small black puppy on his lap on the rug square and conducted, with the small grave efficiency of a child who had been quietly preparing for one of the great moments of his life, the necessary calculations. "Where am I going to put you, Mr. Cuddles?" he said aloud, very softly. The puppy in his lap attempted to chew the hem of his too large jumper. His teeth were, Harry noticed, very white and very pointed and very promising, but the chewing he was doing was gentle. "Father," said Harry to the lilac, "where do I put him?" The shadow said nothing for a long moment. Then it said dryly, "I would suggest a shadow." Harry blinked. "A shadow," he said. "You will find," said the shadow, "that creatures of my line travel in shadow. There is, perhaps, in your part of the garden a place where the shadow of something stands all afternoon. He can sleep there. He will not be visible to anyone you do not wish to see him. You will need to learn in time to direct him in and out. We will practice. For today, put him in the lilac shadow. Tell him to stay. He will stay until you call him out." Harry, who had not been told until that afternoon that anyone in his family had a magic he could perform with his hands, considered this a great deal of new information for one Wednesday. He carried Mr. Cuddles to the lilac. He knelt down. He placed the puppy very gently in the deep, cool darkness where the shadow of the lilac met the brickwork of the back wall. "Stay there, please," said Harry, with all the courtesy he could muster. The puppy looked at him with the patient, considering eyes of a creature that has spent its long life in shadows and knew shadows in the way Harry's classmates knew the streets they lived on. The puppy did not exactly sit. It did, however, drop its small black bottom into the deep dark of the lilac shadow, and a strange thing happened to its outline. It did not exactly disappear. It became, more accurately, a part of the shadow. Harry, looking at it from 2 feet away, could still see the small red ember eyes and the small, soft, wet nose, but if he had walked past at any distance, he would have walked past a lilac shadow. There was no puppy in it. There was only a shadow. Harry sat back on his heels. How do I call him out, Father? Snap your fingers. That's all. It is enough. He is not a hard summons, Harry. He is yours. He will come for a snap of your fingers, for a whisper of his name, for a thought eventually. We will start with the fingers. Harry snapped his fingers. Mr. Cuddles burst out of the lilac shadow with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a small black projectile that loves its boy more than it loves its own dignity, and head-butted Harry in the stomach. Harry went over on the lawn, laughing, with the puppy on his chest licking his face. In the lilac, the shadow watched. Again, said Hades gently. They practiced for 38 minutes. By the time Petunia's key turned in the front door, Mr. Cuddles was in the lilac shadow, asleep, and Harry was on his rug square with the long division finished, and there was nothing in the garden, by all the ordinary measurements, that had not been in the garden that morning. But Harry, when his aunt came out to the back step with the kettle going and a packet of biscuits in her hand, looked up at her with a small, unguarded grin that Petunia had not seen on his face since the morning of the blackbirds. She paused on the step. "What have you done, lad?" she said, with the wary humor of a woman who has been preparing for this moment for a long time. Harry, who had decided in the last 38 minutes that he would not lie to Aunt Petunia about anything ever again if he could help it, but who had also decided, on his shadow father's instruction, that this particular news could be staged, said honestly, "I made a friend, Aunt Petunia, a small one." Her eyes very briefly went to the lilac. She did not immediately ask. She set the kettle on the back step. She handed him a digestive biscuit. She said, "How small?" "Quite small, Aunt Petunia. Hidden where I can't see it." "Yes, please, Aunt Petunia, for now," Father said. "He said you'd see him, just not today." Petunia considered her nephew. She considered the lilac. She considered the long career of unlikely events her sister had set in motion by going into a wood north of Inverness on Beltane in 1979. She considered what was good for the boy and what was good for her marriage, and what, against all wishes of her own, was good for the small project that had been growing in her chest, against her instructions, for several years now. She sighed. "All right, Harry, for now, drink your tea. Don't let Uncle Vernon see whatever it is. Don't let Dudley near it. Don't tell anyone outside this house. And lad, yes, Aunt Petunia," she paused. "Is it kind?" Harry, with his face still split by the small private grin of a boy who has just been given his first real possession in 8 years of life, said, "He is the kindest thing I have ever met, Aunt Petunia." She nodded once briskly and went inside. In the lilac, the shadow, before it withdrew for the day, registered the entire conversation with the kind of approval that has, in 3,000 years of his career, almost never appeared in the personal records of the Lord of the Pit. Petunia Dursley, in his private esteem, went up another notch. Mr. Cuddles grew. He grew in the first 3 months the way ordinary puppies grow. A sudden length of leg here, a sudden width of chest there, the elongation of a snout that had been small and snub, and then, at some point in the second week, became suddenly long and serious. By the time Harry was 8.5, Mr. Cuddles, in his shadow under the lilac, had reached the size of a respectable terrier. By the time Harry was 9, Mr. Cuddles in his shadow was the size of a large lurcher. By the time Harry was 9.5, the lilac shadow was, in cool honesty, not really big enough for him, and Harry, on his shadow father's instructions, took to having Mr. Cuddles spend his afternoons in the deep cool darkness under the garden shed, where the shadow was wider and the smell of wood smoke could mix with the smell of old creosote and not be noticed. By the time Harry was 10, the shed shadow was also not really big enough for Mr. Cuddles, who had reached the size of a small black pony. His teeth were, by 10, the length of Harry's thumb. His eyes, by 10, were the size of small ripe plums. His tongue, when he licked Harry's face, which he still did every single afternoon on being summoned, went in a single sweep from Harry's chin to his hairline. He was, by 10, also still convinced that he was a small lap dog. This was the great quiet comedy of Harry's childhood. He would sit after school on the rug square in the back garden, and he would snap his fingers, and a creature the size of a small horse would, with the wholehearted joy of a small puppy, fling itself out of the shed shadow and attempt to fit itself onto Harry's 9-stone lap. They had developed by long experiment a successful compromise position, Harry sitting cross-legged with his back against the wall of the kitchen, and Mr. Cuddles in a tight, careful spiral, head on Harry's knees, body curled around him, tail very gently, very, very gently thumping the lawn. His ember eyes in this position would close. He would sigh out wood smoke. He would, on warm days, snore. Aunt Petunia met him formally when Harry was 9. She had been in the kitchen washing up on a Saturday morning when Vernon had taken Dudley to a model train show in Reading. Petunia had been watching her nephew out of the kitchen window, the way she did, while doing the breakfast dishes. She had seen in the late spring light a thing happen at the foot of the shed that ought not, by the standards of Privet Drive, to have been happening, and she had set down the tea towel. She had walked, very deliberately, out to the back garden. Harry on the lawn had been sitting with his back against the kitchen wall and a small black horse. At that age, Mr. Cuddles was already pony-sized, curled around him with its head on his knee. He had looked up when his aunt approached, and his face had gone, briefly, the color of pale milk. Mr. Cuddles on the lawn had lifted his enormous head and looked at Petunia. Petunia on the lawn had looked at Mr. Cuddles. There had been a small, dreadful, decisive moment. The hellhound, after the smallest pause, had risen, not quickly, not aggressively, but with a slow and immense courtesy that no dog of any ordinary breed has ever managed, and bowed. He had bowed to her. He had lowered his enormous black head all the way to the lawn and held it there. His tail had not moved. His red ember eyes had been hidden under his fringe. Harry, with one hand on the dog's collar, which was, Petunia noticed, a band of woven black leather she had not bought and had no provenance for, had said in a small voice, "Aunt Petunia, this is Mr. Cuddles." She had stood on the lawn for a long time. She had said, finally, in a voice so dry it surprised herself, "Mr. Cuddles." "Yes, Aunt Petunia, Father chose the name. I chose it." Father agreed. "It is," said Petunia with great care, "a very ugly name for a very large dog." "Yes, Aunt Petunia." She had walked slowly to the hellhound. She had looked down at his bowed head. She had thought in that moment, very vividly, of the small black blackbird feather on the back step the morning the cat had killed 3 birds, and of the silver-bellied moon over the wood north of Inverness on Beltane, and of a small bundle on her doormat in November of 1981. She had very deliberately taken off her gardening glove. She had lowered her hand. She had laid it on the great, wide, flat black head of the hellhound. He had not moved. She had, with the same care she had given the dead cat she had returned to Mrs. No. 2, scratched, very gently, behind his enormous left ear. The hellhound on the lawn had given out a small grunting sigh of pleasure that had shaken 3 early roses off the bush by the wall. His tail had thumped twice. The thumps had been heard through the brickwork by Mrs. No. 6, who would tell her husband at lunch that something had banged twice in the Dursley garden that morning. Mr. No. 6 would tell her not to be ridiculous. Petunia had said, in a voice that was now perfectly normal, "Mr. Cuddles, my name is Petunia. I will be in the kitchen. Tea is at 4. You are not to come into my kitchen at any time. You are not to be seen by my husband at any time. You are not to be seen by Dudley at any time. You are in the back garden and on the lawn here, welcome. Do you understand me?" The hellhound had very slowly raised his enormous head. He had looked at her with his red ember eyes. He had nodded. It had been a single, unmistakable, deliberate, dignified dog's nod. Petunia had nodded back. She had put her gardening glove back on. She had walked to the kitchen, with her shoulders absolutely straight, and she had finished the washing up, and she had not said a single word to a single living soul about the dog or about anything else for the entire rest of that day. It was the same evening, after Vernon and Dudley were back and asleep, that she had gone in her dressing gown very quietly into the back garden and had walked to the shed and had said into the darkness, "Lord, I do not know what to call you. Lord Hades, Hades, sir, Lord, I am Petunia. I am the boy's aunt. I have something to say to you. I do not require an answer, sir, but I would like to say it." There had been, for a long moment, no answer. Then in the deep, cool darkness under the shed, the shadow had moved, and the smell of wood smoke had thickened, and a low voice that she would not, ever after, be able to entirely describe had said, "Speak, Petunia Evans Dursley. I am here." She had said with the unguarded courage of a woman who had been preparing in her head for this conversation for 18 months. "Thank you for the dog. Thank you for him. He needed something of his own. He has not had anything of his own. I have been unable, sir, for reasons of my own, to give him what my sister would have given him. I have tried in small ways. I am still trying. But you have given him a thing I could not have given him, and I wanted to say thank you. That's all." "Thank you." The shadow had been still for a long second. Then it had said, with a courtesy she had not been prepared for, "You have given him, Petunia, the only roof he has had, and the only mother figure he has had, and a great deal more than your husband knows about, and a great deal more than the wizarding world will ever credit you with. I see your accounts. They are larger than you allow yourself to count them. You are a daughter, also in your own way, of a goddess. You are the child your mother raised, and you have her courage, and you have her stubbornness. I thank you. I will, in my time, repay you. You will not know when, but you will know how. She had stood very still. She had said at last, "He is dear to me, sir. I am sorry it has taken me so long to say so." "He knows," said the shadow. "He has always known." She had nodded once. She had walked back to the house, and she had let herself in by the back door, and she had cried very briefly into a dishcloth. Vernon had not woken up. Hades's dream lessons in those years became, by the small daily increments by which they had begun, the great spine of Harry's hidden life. They began, generally, the same way. Harry would fall asleep on the gray blanket in the cupboard with one hand under his cheek and the small ember-red glow of Mr. Cuddles's eyes. For the dog, when Harry was inside, slept in the shadow of the hall coat stand, 8 feet from the cupboard door, with his enormous head laid sideways against the wood, listening to the boy breathe, and he would fall in his dreams into a long, quiet corridor lined with black stone. He would walk. He had walked, by his 10th year, miles of that corridor in dreams. At the end of the corridor was, always, a room. The room had different shapes on different nights. Sometimes it was a library. Sometimes it was a garden. Once it had been a small bare kitchen with a pot of stew on the stove that Hades had stirred while they talked. Once it had been a court of polished marble with a chair Harry had not been invited to sit in. Once it had been a meadow. His shadow father was, in each of these dreams, the same. Tall, pale, slate-eyed, slow of motion, courteous of word. He had a habit of walking with his hands folded behind his back and his head tipped slightly down, the way certain professors did, the way certain bachelors did, the way grandfathers in old films did. The lessons were technically of necromancy. They were not, by any wizarding measurement, light. But they were taught with the patience of a god who had 3,000 years of teaching experience and one previously unused capacity for fatherly affection, and they were taught with a single firm rule that Hades repeated in different forms in every lesson until it became a rule Harry could feel in his bones. The rule was defense only. Death is mine to grant, Harry, not yours. Yes, father, you will be tempted. The temptation will come from the people who hurt you. The temptation will be quick. The hand will know what to do. The hand will be wrong, Harry. The hand will be wrong even when the temptation is just. Yes, father, you may turn aside a blow. You may break a spell. You may put a shadow between you and a man who means you harm. You may set Mr. Cuddles on any creature that means you harm and whose harm cannot be dissuaded by other means. You may not, in your own right, end a life that has not earned ending, and you may not, even in your own right, end a life that has earned ending unless you have asked me first and I have agreed. Do you understand me, Harry? Yes, father. And if I am not available, and I will, on rare occasions, not be available, you are to take your worst case and the most likely set of futures it offers, and choose the option that leaves the most lives intact. Even in some cases, the life of the person who is currently trying to take yours. Do you understand me, Harry? Yes, father. Good. The lessons of the dream corridor were many. There was the lesson on shadows, how to read them, how to step into them, how to send a creature through one. There was the lesson on bones, not how to raise them, but how to recognize where they lay and how to leave them at peace. There was the lesson on names, the lesson in particular on the great quiet truth that everything dead had a name, that the name was the thing the dead would always answer to, and that the name was the thing one should be most careful about using, because to call the dead by their proper name in a place where they had been heard was to invite them to come back, and dead people who had been called back rarely came back in the shape they had left. There was the lesson on the river. Hades had taken him, the night before his 9th birthday, in dream, to the shore of a river so black and so cold that it had not, when Harry knelt, even reflected him. Hades had laid one long hand on Harry's shoulder. He had said, "This is the Styx. It is the river that records oaths. If you fall into it, I will not be able to fetch you out. If you swear by it, you will be held to your word in ways that no force on earth can equal. If you draw water from it for any reason of your own, you are drawing a power that is mine and you should not. I show it to you tonight because you must, by knowing of it, know also what it costs. Will you remember this? Yes, father. There will come a day when the small Patronus you will be taught at school, by the trembling werewolf they have given you for a teacher, will form from the wrong tradition for who you are. It will be a Patronus of a different river. The river will be this one. The Patronus will not be a deer like your father's or an otter like your mother's. It will be the river itself. I am sorry, Harry. I am not sorry, Harry. Do you understand? I think so, father. Good. There was the lesson on grief, which was a long, quiet one, and which Harry did not quite understand at the time. There was the lesson on debt. Who owed Hades, who Hades owed, what the bookkeeping of the realm was, and what it had cost, more particularly, his shadow father to come for him on the night of Halloween, 1981. There was the lesson on Lily, which Hades told him in pieces very gently over many nights. There was, in particular, the lesson on the soul fragment behind Harry's scar. Hades had told him about it formally on the morning of his 10th birthday in the dream kitchen with the stew on the stove. He had sat Harry down at the small wooden table. He had said, "You have a thing inside you, Harry, that is not yours. It is a fragment of the man who killed your mother. It is approximately the size of a grain of sand. It was lodged in you on the night he died, and I sealed it down because I had decided, on the spot, that I wanted to know where it was. I want you to know about it now because you are old enough." Harry had looked at his hands. The lightning scar on his forehead had not throbbed, it had only very softly gone slightly cold. "Will I have to do anything with it, Father?" "No, Harry, you will not have to do anything. I will do something with it in my own time. 6 others like it are scattered in the world. I am taking my time to gather them. I do not wish to alarm the wizards. I am, in any case, in no hurry. The man who made them will not, when I am ready, be in any position to argue. Do you understand?" "I think so, Father. You are not to fear the fragment. It is not in charge of you. It does not own any part of you. I have its papers. It is, in any sensible accounting, mine. I have, however, left it where it is because I wanted, when the time came, for you to have the satisfaction of carrying it home to me yourself. It is your inheritance in part. It is your enemy's death warrant in part. It is both." Harry, on the morning of his 10th birthday in the dream kitchen, had nodded. He had asked, after a moment, the only question he had. "Does it hurt, Father?" "No, Harry." "Will I have to be alone when it comes out?" "No, Harry." "Will you be there?" "Yes, Harry." "All right." He had eaten his stew. The Patronus came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before he was due to receive a particular letter. This is, again, an unusually domestic detail for the moment. A son of Hades cast his first Patronus. But Harry's life ran on Tuesdays as it ran on Wednesdays, and the Tuesday in question had been ordinary up to the point at which it had stopped being ordinary. He had been, that afternoon, on the rug square in the back garden. Mr. Cuddles, who at 10 was now a hellhound the size of a Shetland pony and barely contained by the shadow of the shed, had been curled around him in his usual tight spiral, snoring out small puffs of wood smoke. Petunia had been in the kitchen, ironing one of Vernon's shirts. The day had been thin, gray, and quiet. Harry's shadow father had visited briefly that morning in the deep shade of the elder tree. He had said only, "Tonight, Harry, there is a small lesson I will give you tonight. You will need it. Be ready." Harry had said, "Yes, Father," and gone in for tea. But on this particular Tuesday, the small lesson had come earlier than expected because the world had moved. There had been in the garden all at once a cold. It was not the cold of the day, which had been ordinary. It was the cold that Harry had only ever felt in dreams, on the bank of the Styx. It was the kind of cold that did not exactly lower a temperature. It removed, instead, certain warmths from the air that one had not realized were there. Mr. Cuddles in his lap had lifted his enormous head. There had been over the back fence of number 4 a thing. It had not exactly been visible. It had been a smear of darkness in the wrong direction. The smear had paused. It had been listening. It had been smelling. Harry, with the cold instinct of a boy who had been raised, in part, by a god, had known immediately what it was. The library books in the cupboard had not, by then, told him. The dream lessons had. It had been the kind of creature that, by all rights, ought not to have come to Privet Drive at all, and which had only been called there by the moving accounts of a war that was coming back, and by certain people in the wizarding government beginning, however carelessly, to make rumors about a boy. It had been in its native habitat, a guard of the wizard prison of Azkaban. It had been a Dementor. Hades in his palace had not been able immediately to come. He was in the middle of a court session involving a Roman senator who had been holding up his afterlife by argument for 2,000 years, and was, that afternoon, finally going to be made to take his sentence. Hades could not, in honor, abandon the bench mid-argument, but Hades had all the same opened his hand in the dream room and with a small flat motion sent a message. It had arrived in Harry's mind as one short sentence in his shadow father's voice: "Patronus, River, now." Harry on the lawn, with Mr. Cuddles already up and growling deep in his enormous chest, and the smear of dark over the back fence beginning to slide down toward the lawn. Harry, who had not yet been taught the wand words for a Patronus, who did not yet have a wand, who did not yet have the slightest notion that he was the boy in any prophecy, but who had been taught by a god of the underworld, every night for 2 years in dreams. The small particular grammar by which a son of Hades summons cold from the river that records oaths. Harry stood up. He did not raise a hand. He had no hand for it. He raised instead his small voice, and he spoke into the air over the back garden, the 3 short words his shadow father had taught him in dream 2 months earlier for exactly this kind of moment. The words were not Latin, they were not English, they were Greek, they were the names of 3 rivers, spoken in the order of their flow. He said them. The cold in the back garden of number 4 Privet Drive all at once became the cold of the Styx. In the air in front of him, fully formed, in a single sudden bloom of dark blue light that was not quite light, there appeared a creature. It was a dog. Or it was, perhaps more accurately, the idea of a dog, a kind of dog that no human eye had seen in 3,000 years. It was about the size of a wolf. Its fur was made of ice. Its 3 heads, for it had 3 heads all attached in the proper way to a single muscular body, turned, 3 pairs of glowing dark blue eyes blazing under 3 ridges of frost, and faced the Dementor as one. The middle head opened its mouth and roared. The roar was not, at first hearing, loud. It was the sound a river makes under ice when one stands above it on a winter night. It was the sound of 3,000 years of unimpeachable record. It was the sound of every oath that had ever been kept and every oath that had ever been broken being read out together in a single irrefutable verdict. And the verdict was, "You do not belong here." The Dementor, over the back fence, made a sound Harry had never heard a creature make and would, mercifully, never hear again. It folded in on itself like wet cloth and was, in 2 seconds, gone. The small Cerberus of Stygian ice in the back garden of number 4 Privet Drive looked, over its 3 muscular shoulders, at Harry. The middle head wagged its tongue. The left head licked its lips. The right head, which appeared to be the most thoughtful of the 3, gave Harry a small, formal nod that Harry would, later in life, recognize as exactly the same nod Mr. Cuddles had given Aunt Petunia on the lawn in the spring. Then the Cerberus, with great courtesy, dissolved. The back garden was, all at once, the back garden again. The sun came out from behind the cloud it had been behind, the way suns do at the close of a small event. Mr. Cuddles on the lawn gave one short approving bark that shook 3 apples loose from the neighbor's tree. Harry, on his rug square, sat down very suddenly. His knees, he noticed with mild surprise, were shaking. In the kitchen, Petunia, who had been ironing a shirt, had paused with the iron in the air. She had felt it, all of it. She had not seen anything. She had only felt, briefly, the temperature of the world drop, and then the temperature of the world correct, and the small, precise hush that follows certain weather. She had finished the shirt. She had put the iron down. She had walked, without rushing, to the back door. She had looked at her nephew on the rug square. She had said, "Harry, what did you just do?" He had looked up at her with wide, slightly dazed, deeply astonished green eyes. He had said with the small, unself-conscious honesty of a boy who did not yet know that what he had just done was, by every measurement of the wizarding world, impossible. I think I made a kind of dog, Aunt Petunia, out of cold. Father told me how. There was a thing over the fence. It went away." She had looked for a long moment at the back fence. There was, of course, nothing there. She had said very evenly, "Come inside, Harry. I'll make you a cup of tea." He had come inside. She had made him a cup of tea. She had, while it brewed, washed her hands at the sink for a very long time. She had said, with her back to him, in the same evenly surly voice, "You'll be getting a letter soon, lad, from a school. I had thought I would not have to tell you for another month. Yes, Aunt Petunia, you'll go, of course you'll go. Yes, Aunt Petunia. There are people there who knew your mother. There are people there who knew your father, James, I mean. There are people there who do not know about the other part of you. You will not, lad, tell them, not at first, not even if they ask kindly, especially not if they ask kindly. Yes, Aunt Petunia." She had set the tea down in front of him. She had said, very softly, looking at her nephew across the formica, "You'll do well, Harry. You will. I know you will." He had looked up at her. He had said with the small, unguarded honesty he had been saving up for years, the one that his shadow father had taught him was never, ever to be wasted on a person who had not earned it. "Thank you, Aunt Petunia, for everything." She had not, to her credit, cried. She had drunk her own tea. That night the letter from Hogwarts arrived on the doormat. Chapter 4 The letter, the wand, the sorting, and the wraith in the turban. The letter, by Petunia's discreet arrangement, was the only one. Vernon Dursley would, in later years, recount to anyone who would listen that the owls had blackened the sky, and that he had taken his family to a wretched hovel on a rock in the sea to escape them. None of this happened. Petunia, on the morning of the first letter's arrival, sat Vernon down with 2 soft-boiled eggs and a strong cup of tea, and made the speech she had been writing in her head in small, careful sentences for 9 years. "Vernon," she said, in the level voice she reserved for the most important conversations of her marriage, "the boy is going to be sent away to a school. He is going to a school for boys like his father. He will be gone 10 months of the year, including all the major holidays. He will be paid for entirely by a trust set up by his parents. He will not, when he comes home for the small remaining weeks of the summer, embarrass us in front of our neighbors. He will not, when he is at the school, return any communication to this house unless I personally request it. He will, in short, be out of our way. I have, dear, looked into this very thoroughly. I have made the necessary arrangements. The man who will take him to the school will come on the date arranged to the door in ordinary clothing on an ordinary morning, and there will be no fuss. Will you please, my love, give me this one decision? Vernon Dursley had blinked at her over the rim of his teacup. He had said, after a long moment of trying to organize his face in 3 or 4 different directions at once, will the boy come back? Only for some weeks of the summer. Some, 6 at most. I will be the judge of when he returns and when he leaves. And the trust pays for everything. Everything, my love. Vernon Dursley had considered. His political instincts, which were the only instincts he was, in the deeps of his soul, fully tuned to, had reported back to him that this was, improbably, a victory. He had decided, with the magnanimity he reserved for the moments at which he had won, to be magnanimous. All right then, Petunia. If you've sorted it, you've sorted it. I won't pretend I'll miss him, but I will say that I find I have, against my better judgment, gotten used to him on the back step. Now where's that paper? She had passed him the paper. She had not in her entire life been more proud of a piece of household diplomacy than she was of that morning. The boy would go. Vernon would, by his own self-importance, leave him alone. And the small, careful, 8-year private project of getting her sister's son to his proper school, without any further damage to anyone in her household, was now, by Petunia's quiet generalship, complete. The man who came to the door, on the appointed morning, was not Hagrid. Petunia, when she had read the letter, she had taken it out of Harry's hand the moment it arrived, with the brisk competence of a woman who had been preparing for it, and read it herself, and only then handed it back, had written to the school. She had not gone to the school. She had not sent an owl, because she did not, on principle, own an owl, and had no intention of acquiring one. She had written by ordinary post, to the address printed at the bottom of the letter in small green script, and she had requested, in 3 short paragraphs, a particular favor. The favor had been that the boy not be collected by Rubeus Hagrid. She had not put this as a slight. She had put it plainly in language a deputy headmistress would understand. My nephew is a quiet child of careful habits. He has been raised to expect courtesy. I do not wish to risk frightening him on his first day in your world by sending him a man whose appearance, I am told, can be alarming. I have heard from sources that Mr. Hagrid is a kind man and that his heart is true. I am sure he is. But he is not, on this particular morning, the right man for this particular boy. Send, please, a witch or wizard of moderate appearance, plain clothing, and steady manner. I will receive them at the front door, on the morning indicated at 10. Minerva McGonagall, in her tower office at Hogwarts, had read this letter 3 times. She had, on the 3rd reading, made a small surprised sound at the back of her throat. She had folded the letter and put it in her left desk drawer. She had then, in her own hand, written a brief reply to Mrs. Petunia Dursley of No. 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, indicating that she herself would attend. She had not told the headmaster. Albus Dumbledore was, at the time, on a separate matter in Antwerp, and Minerva McGonagall, who had once been the head girl of Hogwarts, and had once danced a slow waltz with Hades's father at a wedding in Inverness in 1936 without knowing that was who she was dancing with, had decided, on the strength of 3 readings of one letter, that she would prefer, in this case, to make her own assessment. She arrived at the door of No. 4 at 5 minutes to 10, in a tweed traveling coat of a green so dark it was almost black, and a tartan scarf, and stout walking shoes, and a small black handbag. She rang the bell. She was admitted by Petunia, who was wearing her best Sunday cardigan, and led, with the careful procedure of a formal reception, into the front parlor. Vernon had been informed that a representative of the school would attend at 10. He had been instructed to remain at the breakfast table with his paper, and to remain there until summoned. He had complied. He had indeed looked through the kitchen door at McGonagall as she had walked through to the parlor, taken in her tweed coat and her tartan scarf, and concluded that she was the head mistress of a small Scottish girls' school of the kind he had seen pictured in color supplements, and lost interest. This was, of course, exactly the assessment Petunia had hoped for. In the parlor, the door closed. Minerva McGonagall and Petunia Dursley shook hands. McGonagall said, "Mrs. Dursley, thank you for the letter." Petunia said, "Thank you for coming yourself." They sat down. Petunia poured the tea. McGonagall took milk, no sugar. Petunia took no milk, no sugar. Harry, who had been instructed to wait on the stairs until called, sat very carefully on the 3rd step from the top, with his hands folded on his knees, and listened to the two women in the front room without intending to. McGonagall said, "Where is the boy?" "On the stairs, listening, I believe." "Quite reasonable. Shall we call him in?" "In a moment. I want please to speak to you first. Will you allow me a great deal of frankness?" There was a small Scottish pause. "You will have whatever frankness you wish, Mrs. Dursley." "Then I will say two things and ask you one. The first thing is, my nephew is not what he is recorded in your school's papers to be. The second thing is, I am asking you personally, Professor, to take an interest in him, not on the headmaster's behalf, not on the school's behalf, on your own. I am asking it of you, woman to woman in this front parlor with the door closed. I will not ask it again. I have one question. May I ask it?" McGonagall, who had been holding her tea exactly steady, set her cup down on the saucer. "What is the question, Mrs. Dursley? Will you, when the time comes, be a friend to him?" There was a small professional silence. McGonagall took then an unprofessional breath. She said, "Yes, Mrs. Dursley, I will. I see plainly that you are asking me with a depth I do not yet understand. I do not need to understand it to answer. I will be his friend. You have my word." "You may please call the boy in." Petunia did not say thank you. She nodded once, the kind of small Surrey nod a woman gives when she has secured the only piece of insurance she could afford. She rose. She walked to the parlor door. She opened it. She looked up the stairs. She said, "Harry, come down, please. The professor is here." He came down. He was that morning neatly turned out in clothes Petunia had ordered from the children's section of Marks and Spencer on her own account 3 weeks earlier, and which had not been Dudley's old anything for the first time in his life. He was wearing gray trousers, a white shirt, a dark green jumper, and brown shoes. His black hair, which would never lie flat, was nonetheless newly washed. He paused at the parlor door, the way a boy does at the threshold of a room he is not fully sure he is allowed to enter, and then he came in, and he sat down, and he was introduced formally to the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts School. McGonagall looked at him. It is one of the small private records of Minerva McGonagall's life that she had, before this morning, met Lily Evans, and Lily Evans's son, only once at the Potter wedding, when the child had been 3 months old, asleep on his mother's shoulder. She had not then looked closely. She did now. She saw, sitting on her sister-in-arm's sofa in a front parlor in Little Winging, a small, thin, dark-haired boy of nearly 11, with vivid green eyes that were briefly, on first glance, very precisely Lily's eyes, and which then, as she looked, settled the way the bottom of a pond settles into something slightly older. She saw also on his small shoulders and on the small line of his careful jaw a thing she had not been expecting. It was not a Potter thing. It was not exactly an Evans thing. It was a composure. The composure of a child who had been, in the deep ways, well raised by somebody, and who had also been, in the surface ways, taught not to display the well-raising in case it caused him trouble. She thought all in one beat, "Petunia Dursley, what on earth have you been doing in this house?" She said aloud, with the small precise warmth she allowed her best students, "Hello, Harry, I am Professor McGonagall. I am one of your teachers. I have come to introduce you to my world." Harry, in his small green jumper, with his hands folded on his knees, in the way Petunia had taught him to fold them when meeting an important person, looked up. He said, with the unguarded honesty he had been saving for the small subset of people he had been told, in advance, were worth it, "Hello, Professor. Thank you for coming yourself instead of the kind giant. Aunt Petunia thought it would be gentler." Minerva McGonagall, who had been a Hogwarts professor for 40 years and had been forced, very rarely, to revise her opinion of a stranger inside the first 3 minutes of meeting them, revised her opinion of Petunia Dursley upward by a substantial degree, in the small private spreadsheet she kept of such things. She said gravely, "Your aunt has good judgment. Mr. Hagrid is a wonderful man, but you and I will get along splendidly. Shall we go to Diagon Alley?" "Yes, please, Professor. Mrs. Dursley, will you come with us?" Petunia, who had been preparing not to be asked, paused. She said, "No, Professor. He should make this trip without me. It will be easier for him. I should not be there. There are old reasons. He will explain to you in time if he chooses. I will be here when he returns. Bring him back by tea." McGonagall, who was extremely good at hearing what was not said, nodded. She stood up. She offered her hand to Harry. He took it. At the front door he turned and he hugged Petunia, briefly and without warning, the way he had not done in 8 years. She did not, to her credit, cry. She did, when the front door closed behind them, sit down in the parlor and breathe out, for a long, careful minute, into the empty room. Mr. Cuddles, in the shed shadow, gave one soft, sympathetic grunt. In the kitchen, Vernon turned the page of his paper without looking up. McGonagall took him to Diagon Alley by sight-along apparition, which she warned him about, and which she also held his shoulder for, and which he absorbed on emerging in the alley behind the leaky cauldron, with the small, steady composure of a boy who had in his head traveled in stranger ways than this in dreams. He looked around. He looked at the cobblestones. He looked at the witches in long blue robes and the wizards in long red robes and the small children in tiny robes pulling on their parents' sleeves and pointing at owls in cages. He looked at the dragon-shaped lamp brackets on the wall of the leaky cauldron. He looked at the green door of Gringotts at the end of the street, and at the marble pillars, and at the deep arched gate that was, even in daylight, very black. He said in a small voice that contained, McGonagall noted, no fear at all but a great deal of cataloging. Father told me there'd be a lot. I didn't quite imagine it. She was about to ask very gently about Father, but a small, deliberate internal voice, the voice she used to remind herself over a career that she was a professor and not a confessor, held her back. She said instead, it's a good deal. You'll get used to it. We'll start at the bank. We need money for your things. You have a vault. It is, even by some wizard standards, a substantial one. Your father James, left it to you. There will, in years to come, be other things to discuss about your money. Today we will only take what we need for school. Yes, Professor. They went to Gringotts. Harry, who had spent 2 years in dreams in the kind of architecture in which marble was a normal material, did not flinch at any of it. He walked, beside his professor, through the Gringotts hall with the small, steady gait of a boy who had been in deeper rooms. The goblin at the desk, who had been a goblin for 240 years and was, in his own private record, deeply unimpressed by most humans, took one look at Harry across the polished counter and made a small involuntary movement that he would, on review, deny. He said in his most clipped goblin voice, name and key. McGonagall said, Harry Potter, Vault 687, I have the key. The goblin took the key. He looked at it, he looked at Harry, he looked at the key again. He said with an extremely small bow that no human present quite caught, Vault 687, Mr. Potter, this way. In the cart on the way down, for Gringotts is many things, and one of them is a series of tracks that goes very deep into the earth. Harry sat with his hands folded on his knees and watched the carved tunnels rush past, and felt, for the first time, what he would only later come to recognize as the sensation of being in a place that knew his father. It was a small recognition. The Gringotts tunnels do not go anywhere near the realm of Hades. But the goblins have, in their deep way, dug into places that human wizards do not entirely know about. They have, in particular, traded with certain entities that did, in their time, file paperwork with the Lord of the Pit. The walls had, Harry felt, a courtesy, a very small one, like a hat being tipped without anyone moving a hand. He felt his shadow father very briefly in the air around him, the way he had felt him in the corner of the cupboard in the morning. A presence. I am here, Harry, he breathed out. He did not, to his credit, smile. The cart slowed at Vault 687. The goblin opened the door. Inside on the floor were stacks and stacks of gold and silver and bronze coins. Harry, who had not seen money in any quantity in his life, did not, in fact, react to it as the goblins or McGonagall might have expected. He looked at the heaps of coins. He looked at the goblin. He looked at McGonagall. He said, with the small accounting habit he had inherited in Dream, how much, please, will be required for school? Today. McGonagall said, today, Mr. Potter, perhaps 40 galleons. Across all years, a great deal less than this. There is also, Mr. Potter, I should tell you, a second vault, older, set up before you were born, by someone who is not your father James. It cannot be accessed from this one. The goblins have its key. You will be told about it when you come of age. Harry, kneeling and counting 40 gold coins into a leather pouch the goblin had handed him, paused. He looked briefly sideways at his professor. He said, set up by someone who is not my father James. Yes, I see, Professor, thank you. I will perhaps take an interest in that one when I come of age. For now, 40 galleons, please. McGonagall, who had not, in fact, been told by Albus Dumbledore or by any other person anything about who had set up the second vault, she had only seen the entry on the Potter ledgers and noted that the depositor's name was redacted under a tier of confidentiality. She had not seen the goblins use for any other family in Britain, looked at the small boy on the floor of the vault with a fresh wave of professional concern, and decided that she would not ask him. She helped him stand. She helped him put the leather pouch in the inner pocket of his jumper. They went, in the cart, back up. They bought in the next 2 hours, his cauldron, his robes, his books, his quills, his ink, his scales, his telescope, his trunk. They bought, on McGonagall's pressing recommendation, an extra warm cloak for the Scottish winter. They did not buy an owl. Harry, when offered one in the Emporium, looked once at the dim cages, looked once at the bright yellow eyes inside them, and said very politely, Professor, I would rather not, if I may. I do not think I am exactly the right home for an owl. I will, perhaps, write to my aunt by ordinary post. McGonagall had nearly said something. She had not. They left the Emporium. They walked last up the alley to a shop that was, even in the cheerful summer sunlight, an unusually quiet shop. Ollivander's. The bell above the door of Ollivander's was small and bronze and gave a single thin chime. The shop inside was dim and dust-smelling and stacked, floor to ceiling, with thousands of slender boxes, none of them quite parallel to any of the others. Mr. Ollivander, who appeared at the counter without any announced approach, was a small, wispy old man with very pale eyes and very still hands, and a kind of professional stillness that, even in his own crowded shop, gave him the appearance of being alone. He looked at Harry over the counter for a long, considering moment. He said in his soft, careful voice, "Mr. Potter, I have been wondering when I should see you. You have your mother's eyes. It seems only yesterday she was in here herself, buying her first wand. 10¼ inches long, swishy, made of willow. Nice wand for charm work." He paused. "Your father, on the other hand, favored a mahogany wand, 11 inches, pliable, a little more power and excellent for transfiguration." He paused again. He said, with a delicacy Harry would not, until many years later, properly recognize, "I say your father favored it. It is, of course, the wand that chooses the wizard. And the wand that chose you, Mr. Potter, will not be very like either of those. I have had a sense these many years of which wand it would be. I should like to be wrong. I shall begin, however, with some safer options." He took down boxes. Harry tried one. Nothing happened. He tried another. The flowers in a vase on the counter wilted very slightly, and he and McGonagall both noticed it before Ollivander said smoothly, "Try this one, Mr. Potter." He tried that one. The light in the shop dropped half a stop, the way it might before a small evening rain, and Ollivander said smoothly, "Try this one." He tried 4 more. With the fourth, a glass in the back of the shop shattered, very quietly, with no obvious cause. Ollivander gave a small approving nod and shifted to a different shelf. He paused before the next box. He looked at it. He looked at Harry. He looked at McGonagall. He looked at the box again. He said almost to himself, "I had set this one aside many years ago in case it was needed. I have always preferred it not to have been needed. But well, Mr. Potter, if you would." He brought down the box. He set it on the counter. He opened it. Inside was a long, slim, very dark-grained wand. The wood was very, very black, with a sheen so dim it almost was not a sheen. He said, "You, Mr. Potter. 13½ inches, slightly bowed. The core, however, is what is unusual." He paused. "The core is a single tail hair of a thistral. I do not, in this shop, usually work with thistral hair. It is a difficult substance. It is not, by all received wisdom, a kindly core. It is loyal, but only to wizards who have looked death in the face and not turned away. It is in the wrong hand a wand that fails. In the right hand," he looked very carefully at Harry's small wrist. "In the right hand it is a wand that knows what the wizard knows. Take it up, please." Harry took it up. It was light. It was lighter than he had expected. It was warm. It was the same warmth, exactly the same warmth, as the small black puppy that had landed on his maths book on a Wednesday at 7¾ The same bank timber warmth. The same wood smoke smell, only fainter and braided with something else, which Harry in his much older years would identify as the smell of new leaves of yew. He did not, when he raised it, do anything dramatic. He moved it once in a small, careful arc, the way his shadow father had taught him, in dream, to move his arm when greeting a creature larger than himself. The dust in the shop, all of it, in every corner of every shelf, settled at once. 3 boxes on the lowest shelf, behind the counter, opened by themselves and closed again, the way old colleagues acknowledged one another at a club. The wand in Harry's hand gave a small, pleased pulse and then was quiet. Ollivander stood very still behind his counter. He said in a voice that was, even for him, soft, "Yes, that is the one. I should like, Mr. Potter, to make a note of you in my records, with your permission, if you are agreeable. I have not had a wand choice quite like this one in a long time." He paused. He added very privately, in a voice Harry was meant to hear and McGonagall was meant to feel, "Curious. I had set that wand aside on the day a different wand was bought. A holly wand, phoenix feather core, 11 inches, brother to the wand that gave you that scar, Mr. Potter. I had set the yew aside on the assumption that it would be needed in the other direction. I am pleased, very pleased, to discover that it is not. You will not need to be the brother of that wand, Mr. Potter. You will need to be something else entirely. I find that a great relief." Harry, holding the warm dark wand, said very evenly, "Thank you, Mr. Ollivander." Ollivander bowed slightly. McGonagall paid. They left. Outside on the cobbles in the sunlight, McGonagall paused. She said, "Harry." "Yes, Professor, that was an unusual wand." "Yes, Professor. You will not please brandish it. I would prefer you keep it in your pocket for the train ride. I would prefer your housemates not to discuss its specifications, particularly the core. Yes, Professor, you have, I am beginning to suspect, a number of unusual things in your possession. Yes, Professor, I will keep them quiet." She looked at him, sidelong, for a long, careful Scottish moment. She said, finally, "You are not what I was expecting, Mr. Potter." He said, with the small, unguarded honesty he had learned, on his shadow father's instruction, to use only on the people who had earned it. "I'm sorry, Professor. I will try to be better than what you were expecting." She made a small sound that was, in another woman, a laugh. "You will do, Mr. Potter, you will do." She took him home. The train on September the 1st was a long red engine in a steam cloud at platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station, and Harry had been to the station on the Underground with his Aunt Petunia, and Petunia, on the platform on the Muggle side of the barrier, had given him, very briefly, one quick stiff hug, and had pressed a small folded square of paper into his hand and had said, "That's the address of a Muggle postbox in Surrey, lad. You write to it. I'll check it. I'd rather not have your owls, but I'd like to know how you are. Now go on." He had gone on. Mr. Cuddles in shadow had followed him through the barrier. Harry had felt him there, a banked steady warmth at his elbow, all the way down the platform. Mr. Cuddles had, his shadow father had told him in dream, his own way of reaching Hogwarts, and Harry was not to worry about him in transit. Harry was to worry only about doing well in his lessons. He found a compartment with 2 empty seats. He sat, he stowed his trunk. He took out a library book about constellations, which he had borrowed from Aunt Petunia's library 3 days before and had not yet finished. He read. He was joined, after a few minutes, by a tall, lank, dark-haired boy with a pale, pointed face who introduced himself. In the careful, well-bred drawl Harry recognized from the kind of boys his cousin Dudley had once tried unsuccessfully to imitate, as Draco Malfoy. The boy had been about to launch into the practiced speech he had been preparing for months when he was suddenly very still. He was looking, Harry noticed, not at Harry's face. He was looking at the small piece of shadow behind Harry's left shoulder, where, in the dim light of the train compartment, on a long afternoon journey, a single ember-red eye was very faintly visible. Draco Malfoy, in the doorway of the compartment, swallowed. He said in the slightly higher voice of a boy who had been taught, by his very particular father, to recognize particular categories of magical creature. Is that a hellhound?" Harry, on the seat, looked up from his book. He looked very calmly at Draco Malfoy. He said, with the small, unguarded honesty he had learned on his shadow father's instruction to deploy only when it served a clear purpose, "Yes, a small one, smallish. He's a puppy, sort of. He's about the size of a small horse." "Oh," said Draco Malfoy very faintly. "I see. May I sit down, if you'd like?" Draco Malfoy sat very gingerly on the seat opposite. The ember-red eye behind Harry's left shoulder closed courteously. Draco Malfoy folded his hands on his knees. He looked briefly at Harry's forehead. He looked briefly at Harry's wand arm. He looked finally at Harry's eyes. He said, after a long, careful Slytherin pause, I think my father told me about you last week. I think you're going to be in our house. I think you and I should be friends." Harry, who had been raised, in part, by a god of accounts, considered the offer with the small, careful attention he gave to all unsolicited terms. He said, after a moment, "Why?" Draco Malfoy, in the seat opposite, paused. He said, with a candor that surprised himself, "Because I think you're going to be a very serious person at this school, Potter, and I would rather, on the whole, be the friend of a serious person at this school than the rival of one. Especially," he hesitated, then went on, "especially when the serious person travels with a small horse." Harry, with the small, unguarded smile he had been saving for a particular sort of moment, said, "All right, Malfoy. Friends on 3 conditions. Yes, 1, you do not ever call my Aunt Petunia a Muggle. She knows what she is. She does not need a name from your father. Yes. 2, you do not ever ask after my mother in a way that is for your father's benefit and not for mine. Yes. 3, you let me think for a moment before I say yes to anything you say, even when it sounds like it would be a yes. Yes. All right then, friends." He stuck out his hand. Draco Malfoy shook it. Behind Harry's left shoulder, in the shadow, Mr. Cuddles, who had, by long arrangement with his boy, also been allowed an opinion in such matters, gave a small approving snort. Draco Malfoy heard it. He decided, on the spot, not to mention it. 2 more children came to the door of the compartment. They were Ronald Weasley, red-haired and freckled and uncertain, and Hermione Granger, bushy-haired and slightly out of breath and already very nearly the cleverest person on the train. Harry, who had in the dream corridor been told to greet all of his year's children with courtesy, looked up at them, smiled, and stood up. "Come in," he said, with the manners his shadow father had been training into him in dream for 2 years. "I'm Harry. This is Draco. There's plenty of room. We can all sit if you don't mind sitting 4 to a side. Are you hungry? The trolley will be along, I'm told." Ron and Hermione, neither of whom had expected exactly this, and neither of whom had quite imagined that the boy who lived would, on the train ride to Hogwarts, be sitting in calm conversation with the son of Lucius Malfoy, paused briefly in the corridor, and looked at each other, and then in the small, ordinary, trustful way of 11-year-olds, both nodded. The compartment was, by Hogsmeade Station, 4 students. They had eaten a great deal of chocolate frogs, and a great many Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. Hermione had explained, twice, the entire structure of the 4 houses of Hogwarts. Ron had, in turn, explained the principles of Quidditch. Draco had, with great surprising restraint, not once mentioned his father. Mr. Cuddles, in the shadow of the compartment, had napped. In the dream room, 1,000 miles below them, Hades, who had been at his desk going over the day's intake, took a single small note in his ledger. The note read, "My son has made 3 friends. He has been at school for 4 hours. The future has improved." He put the pen down. He smiled very briefly in the privacy of his palace. He picked up the next file. The Sorting Hat had, in its experience, sorted nearly 25,000 children. It had developed, over its long career, a certain professional vocabulary for what it was looking at. It had not, in its long career, ever before been put on the head of a son of Hades. The hat on Harry's head in the candlelit great hall in front of the whole school took an unusually long time. McGonagall, holding the scroll, stood very still. Dumbledore, at the high table in his purple robes, looked in the way only Dumbledore looked, mildly interested. Inside Harry's head, the hat said in a voice that was, even for an old hat, slightly impressed, "Oh, oh dear. Oh well, that is not what I was expecting at all." Harry, in his own head, said, with the polite formal manners his shadow father had drilled into him, "Pleased to meet you, Sir Hat." The hat said, "Plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind, either. There's talent, oh my goodness, yes, and a thirst to prove yourself, plenty of loyalty. And what's this? Yes, you are dear, you are. Harry, where do you think I should go, Sir Hat?" The hat, "There is only one place I can put you, dear. I am sorry. I will not put you in Gryffindor, although your father would have wanted it. I will not put you in Ravenclaw, although you have the brain. I will not put you in Hufflepuff, although you have, against all advertisement, the heart. The one I can put you in is the one that will best teach you how to keep your own counsel, and that is the one that will best understand a serious boy who needs not to be famous. You will be the best of them, dear, if you choose to be, or the worst, you will choose." Harry, "Yes, Sir Hat, I understand." The hat, Slytherin. There was in the great hall a beat of perfect silence. It was not, on review, an unfriendly silence. It was the silence of an audience that had, in a single second, been required to adjust an entire script. Then there was applause, from the Slytherin table, polite and steady. There was, at the Gryffindor table, a great many open mouths and a few small, surprised, half-formed claps. The Ravenclaws were thinking. The Hufflepuffs were unsure. At the high table, Albus Dumbledore, who had been quietly hoping for Gryffindor, allowed his expression to settle into something patient. Severus Snape, who had been quietly preparing himself for the indignity of having to teach Lily Evans's son in his own house, paused mid-sip of his goblet, set the goblet down, and looked, with the careful glittering attention of a man whose internal accounts have just been completely overturned, at the small dark-haired boy walking, calmly, to the Slytherin table. Harry sat between a third-year girl who had not been ready for him and Draco Malfoy, who had jumped up to make space. Draco said under his breath, with a small fierce loyalty Harry would not have predicted, "Don't worry, Potter, you're with us." Harry, with the small unguarded smile he had been saving for the small set of moments at which it was earned, said, "I know, Malfoy, thank you." He looked briefly around the hall. He looked at his housemates, who were watching him with the careful curiosity of any house that had just received an unexpected gift. He looked at McGonagall, who was watching him from the front of the hall with the small private warmth she had not been allowed to spend on him. He looked at the high table. His eyes went past Dumbledore. They went past McGonagall's empty chair. They went past the small, kindly figure of Professor Flitwick. They went past the silent, dark figure of Snape. They went, by a small, precise pull he did not understand, to the figure in the deep purple turban sitting between Snape and a chair currently unoccupied. Professor Quirinus Quirrell, in his deep purple turban, was looking at that moment away from the Slytherin table. He was looking at the wall above McGonagall. But Harry's gaze had gone past him, past the turban, through it. What Harry saw with the Underworld site he had been quietly building up in dreams for 3 years was not Quirrell. It was the small wisp of soul fragment clinging to the back of Quirrell's skull, like a long-stained piece of gray muslin pinned to a wall. The wisp had a face. The face had no nose. The face was looking, with the dark red intent eyes of a wounded animal, directly at Harry. Harry, in the seat at the Slytherin table, with Draco's hand still warm on his shoulder, kept his face entirely still. He had been trained for this. He breathed once in, he breathed once out. He looked with the small, steady, polite gaze of a first year, away from Quirrell's turban and down at his plate and back up at Draco. But in the dream corridor in his shadow father's palace, Hades at his desk paused midline, set his pen down, looked for a long, careful second at the candle in his sconce, and said aloud to no one, "Ah, found him." He picked up his pen. He noted in his ledger, Fragment 1, located, Hogwarts, Defense Against the Dark Arts Post. Awaiting confirmation of host's voluntary cooperation, recommend immediate measures. He paused. He added in his small, dry hand, Mr. Cuddles, observe. In the shadow behind the Slytherin table, Mr. Cuddles, who had napped through the sorting, opened, very quietly, one ember-red eye. It happened in the end on the last night of term, in the corridor on the 3rd floor. The mechanics of the year's events have been recorded elsewhere by other historians in the customary detail. Harry, for his part, was a quiet Slytherin first year who did well in lessons, and well in defense against the dark arts, and exceptionally well in potions. Because Severus Snape, having tried for 2 weeks to humiliate him in class, had quietly given up after Harry on a Thursday, had wordlessly handed in a perfect cauldron of cure for boils, and looked Snape calmly in the eye and said, in a small private voice, "I do not bear my father's name in this room, sir. I am sorry he was unkind to you. I would like to be a good student. I would also like, if it is not too much, to one day discuss my mother with you. Not today, some other day. When you are ready," Snape in his own classroom had, against every fiber of his bitter being, said only, "We will discuss her one day, Mr. Potter. Not today, carry on." It had been the most peaceful conversation Severus Snape had had with any Potter or Evans for 12 years. He had not, after that, been kind to Harry, but he had not been cruel either. Quirrell, for his part, had spent the year teaching very nervously and watching Harry very carefully, and twice, attempting things, once a broom curse during a Quidditch match, which Hermione, who had decided, in the wake of an unfortunate incident with a troll at Halloween, that she was now one of Harry's friends, had aborted by setting Snape's robes on fire, and once a tripped Jinx on a staircase outside the potions classroom, which Mr. Cuddles, from a shadow, had silently absorbed by widening himself across the step. Harry, who had been told by his shadow father that the moment of removal was not yet, had simply observed. He had not all year said the word Voldemort to a single person at the school except Draco, once in private in late February. Draco had gone pale. Draco had said, with the small unforced loyalty he had been quietly redirecting all year from his father to his friend, "If you need anything, Potter, anything at all, you tell me." Harry had thanked him. By June, however, the small wraith on the back of Quirrell's skull had grown impatient. By June, the stone, for that was what the school was hiding, on the 3rd floor corridor, and what the wraith wanted, had become, in Quirrell's mind, more important than caution. He had gone on the last night of term, with the small, dreadful certainty of a man who knew his window was closing, down the corridor on the 3rd floor, through the door, through the Cerberus, the actual 3-headed dog, the one Hagrid had borrowed from a Greek man for a favor, and which, as it happened, had paused mid-snarl to lower its 3 heads in the deepest of bows on first scenting the small black creature trotting behind Quirrell unobserved, through the chess set, through the devil's snare, all the way to the mirror. He had been kneeling in front of the mirror of Eris, trying to discover where the stone was, when the air in the chamber behind him had gone, all at once, very cold. He had turned. Standing in the doorway of the chamber was a small, dark-haired first year in a Slytherin robe. He had his hands by his sides. He was not holding his wand. He looked, in the dim torchlight of the chamber, very young and very calm. Behind him, in a shadow that stretched, impossibly, from the doorway across half the floor, for the shadow of an 11-year-old boy could not, by any natural law, have been so long, there was something else. Something the shape of a small horse. Something with 2 ember-red eyes that, in the dim chamber, gave a soft, banked glow. Quirrell stood up. The turban came off. The wraith at the back of his skull blinked with its red eyes at the small Slytherin first year. The wraith said in its dry, rasping voice, "Potter, so you come in the end, as I always knew you would. The stone, Potter, tell me how to take it from the mirror. I see myself with it. I cannot remove it. There is some trick. You will do it for me. I have, you understand, taken great pains to be here." Harry in the doorway said, with the small, calm courtesy his shadow father had taught him to use only on creatures of certain categories. "I will not, sir, do that." "You will, you have no choice." "I do, sir, I have in fact too." The wraith paused. Quirrell in front of the mirror with the wraith on the back of his skull looked briefly in two directions at once. The wraith said too. "Yes, sir, the first is to walk away. I will do that if you accept the second." "What is the second?" Harry in the doorway said, with the steady gaze of a boy who had been raised in part by a god of accounts. "The second is that you submit now to my father, who has the rest of you in his keeping, and end this. There are 5 other pieces of you, sir. He has on my behalf located all of them. He will, on my permission, bring them in. You may, sir, walk through the door he opens. You will not, sir, like what is on the other side, but it will be quick. I am offering, sir. I will not offer twice." There was in the chamber a small ringing silence. The wraith laughed. It was a very dry laugh. It said, "Boy, you do not know what you offer. You do not know who I am. You do not know what your father is." Harry in the doorway said with the same calm courtesy, "I know what my father is, sir. I know it better than you." The wraith looked for the first time in the conversation past Harry's small, calm face and saw, with the dim-spent eyes of a soul fragment that had been clinging to a stuttering professor for 10 months, the second face behind Harry. The second face was not a face. It was a shadow. The shadow had the precise, still attentive aspect of a tall man in a long charcoal coat, standing 6 feet behind a small boy in a Slytherin robe, with his head tipped slightly down. Tom Marvolo Riddle, in the chamber on the 3rd floor of Hogwarts, in the body of Quirinus Quirrell, in the year 1992, looked at the shadow at the back of the chamber, and for the first time in any of his many lives knew fear. He said in his dry, rasping voice that had begun very slightly to shake, No, you can't. Harry said very quietly, "Sir. The offer is open for 3 seconds. Take it, or I am going to step aside." You would not." 1. "Boy 2, you Potter, you." 3. He stepped aside. The shadow behind him did not move. The shadow behind him did not need to move. It looked only very calmly at the small black creature on its left. The small black creature, which had been waiting, with all the wholehearted patience of a hellhound puppy at the foot of a lilac for 2.5 years, did not need to be told twice. Mr. Cuddles, the hellhound of Hades, who had been, for several months by this point, the size of a small adult horse, who had on his big square skull the carefully woven black leather collar of a god, and who had, in his entire life, never once been allowed to bite anything that was not strictly necessary, came forward at a long, unhurried prowl. His 3 heads, for he had grown very privately in the previous month, the 2 additional heads of a creature of his line, on the express written instruction of his master, in preparation for this moment, moved in their 3 slow, precise ways. The middle head looked at Quirrell. The left head looked at the doorway. The right head, which had been since puppyhood the most thoughtful of the 3, looked up at Harry, briefly, as if for one last confirmation. Harry nodded. The middle head, with a courtesy entirely its own, opened its great wide jaws. Quirrell screamed. The wraith screamed louder. Harry in the doorway did not, by his shadow father's careful instruction, look. He turned his back. He walked calmly out of the chamber. He climbed the long stairs. He stepped back through the devil's snare, which let him through with a courtesy it had not extended to anyone else that year. He stepped last through the door past the original Cerberus, which lowered its 3 heads to him in a deep bow as he went. He did not run. In the chamber behind him, Mr. Cuddles, with the great careful jaws of a hellhound of Hades, finished his work the way he had been trained. The wraith of Tom Marvolo Riddle, on the back of the dead body of Quirinus Quirrell, did not, however, follow Quirrell into deaths. It was the moment Quirrell stopped breathing, lifted by a very deliberate small hand from the shadow at the back of the chamber, and placed in a small sealed jar made of bone. The jar was labeled in a small dry hand, Fragment 1. It was put in a deep cupboard under a marble desk in a palace very far under the ground. The cupboard had 5 other shelves. 5 of them were empty, for the moment. Chapter 5, The Cerberus of Stygian Frost, and the Trial of Pettigrew. There is a kind of professor a school produces, on average, once a generation, and at Hogwarts in the early 90s that professor was Remus Lupin. He was not, when he arrived in the autumn of Harry's 3rd year, what anyone in the castle had been expecting for the defense against the dark arts post. The post itself had developed, by then, a small bleak reputation. In the previous 2 years it had been held by, in order, a wraith of Voldemort glued to the back of a stammering academic's skull, and an elaborately tailored fraud who had, in one of the small private satisfactions of Harry's 2nd year, been very firmly removed from the role on charges of memory tampering. The faculty were, by Lupin's arrival, in the mood for someone competent. They had got instead someone gentle, which is a different category of person entirely and arguably a more useful one. Lupin was 33. He looked older. His robes were always slightly too thin for the season. He had a habit, when he taught, of pausing in the middle of a sentence, taking off his glasses, polishing them on his sleeve, and putting them back on with the small wry smile of a man who had been thinking about something else for a moment, but had now come back to his class. He did not, on principle, raise his voice. He had been raised, his students intuited correctly, in a house where the raising of voices had been a thing to be careful about, and he had decided long ago not to bring that into his own classrooms. By the third week of term, Lupin had, in his small, unobtrusive way, made every student in his classes feel that he was the one teacher they had ever had who had read them properly. By the 6th week, he had made the Slytherins forget, for the duration of the lesson, that they were not supposed to like a teacher who was also the friend of the recently escaped Sirius Black. By the 8th week, he was, in private, with the small ferocious approval of 14-year-olds, considered the best thing that had happened to the castle since the headmaster's lemon sherbets. He had also, very privately, identified by the 3rd lesson the small, dark-haired Slytherin 3rd year in the 3rd row as the most unusual student in his classroom. Lupin had known Harry in another life, when Harry had been a baby and Lupin had been the strange young uncle who came around for tea. He had not, by Lupin's choice and by McGonagall's gentle agreement, made anything of that with Harry in front of the class. He had spoken to him in the 3rd week after the lesson briefly with a small, steady smile. He had said, "Harry, I knew your parents. I had not known I would be your teacher one day. I am very pleased to be. We will in time have a conversation about them if you would like. There is no hurry. I will be here." Harry, on his side of the desk, had said, with the small, unguarded honesty he had learned to deploy in particular cases, "Yes, please, Professor. There is also a thing I would like to discuss with you one day about my mother, about what she was. There is no hurry on that either, but you should know that it is a thing, so that it is not, when it comes up, a surprise to you." Lupin had paused. He had looked with the careful, slow attention of a man who had spent his entire adult life noticing the small underweather of people at the small Slytherin 3rd year in front of him. He had said, after a long beat, "All right, Harry, you will tell me when you are ready. I will not press." He had not pressed. It would, in the small private history of Lupin and Harry's friendship, be a thing Lupin would, in later years, think back on with a small private satisfaction. He had not pressed. He had waited. The patience had, in due time, been rewarded. The Patronus lesson came on a Wednesday in November. It was not a class lesson. It was a private one. There had been, on the train back to school after the Christmas of the previous year, an incident involving a Dementor that had boarded the Hogwarts Express in search of Sirius Black, and which had, to the appalled astonishment of everyone present, entered Harry's compartment, paused for a long-held moment over Harry, made a sound no Dementor was supposed to be able to make, and then, with an unsteady reluctance no Dementor was supposed to feel, withdrawn without taking a soul. Harry had not, in the small, unguarded honesty he allowed only at certain times, said anything about what had passed between him and the Dementor in those held seconds. He had in fact found, by the small unhurried underworld sight he had quietly built up since the age of 7, that the Dementor was something his shadow father had a long professional relationship with, and that the Dementor, on entering the compartment, had recognized whose son Harry was and had withdrawn out of interdepartmental courtesy. He had not, however, been able to explain this to Hermione, who had been with him and who had been deeply alarmed, and who had insisted in the days that followed that someone teach him a Patronus charm. Lupin had agreed. The first lesson had been in an empty classroom on the 2nd floor on a Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Lupin had brought tea. He had brought also a small wooden box containing a single boggart, which he had borrowed from a closet on the 3rd floor for the occasion. The Patronus charm, Lupin had said in his quiet, careful way, sitting in a chair across from Harry with his hands folded in his lap, is one of the most demanding pieces of magic many witches and wizards ever attempt. It requires you to hold, against the cold of a Dementor, a moment of warmth. The moment can be anything. Your job in the cast is to hold it whole. The harder the memory, the brighter the Patronus. Shape of the Patronus when it comes is, well, it is the shape of the thing in you that, when you reach for warmth, comes up to meet you. Some people get does, some people get badgers. My own is a slightly nervous rabbit, I'm afraid. We do not, in general, choose the shape, it chooses us. Harry had said, sitting on his side of the desk with his wand on his knee. "Yes, Professor. The incantation is expecto patronum. Stress on the second O. Yes, Professor. Hold the memory, then the wand. Then the words, 'Yes, Professor.' And Harry, there is no shame in not getting it on the first try. There is no shame in not getting it on the 10th. There is in fact only one thing that would be a shame, which is to try and to give up. You will in this room try as many times as you like. We have tea, we have biscuits, we have until I am tired, which given recent moons is approximately 45 minutes. Are you ready? Harry had said, yes, Professor. He had stood up. In his own head, he had, before the cast, done the thing his shadow father had taught him to do 2 nights earlier in Dream, in preparation for exactly this lesson. He had reached not for a moment of warmth, in the way Lupin had described, but for a name. He had reached for the name his shadow father had spent 2 years of dream lessons preparing him to use. He had reached for the river. Lupin, on the other side of the room, opened the wooden box. The boggart, which was unusually obliging that afternoon, took the shape of a Dementor. It was, for the purposes of the lesson, close enough. The cold in the classroom descended. Harry, on his side of the room, did not, on this occasion, speak in English. He spoke in the language his shadow father had taught him for this. He said 3 short Greek words in the order of 3 rivers. His wand was, technically, the focus. His shadow father, in Dream, had told him that for an ordinary wizard the wand was the engine of the spell, but that for a son of his line, the wand was the lens of a much older lamp. The wand lit. Out of the tip of the wand bloomed a darkness that was, immediately and unmistakably, not the white-silver mist of a Patronus. It was a darkness like a vein of deep blue water through black ice. It was the precise color of the river that had not reflected him on the night of his 9th birthday. It came out of the wand at a steady, measured speed, and it organized itself, in the air, with the calm structural confidence of a creature that knew exactly what it was meant to be. It grew. 3 heads of frost lifted, one after the other, out of a single muscular neck, a long-spined back, edged with the small gray points of Stygian ice. 4 powerful legs, set neatly on the air, with the soft pad prints of a hound rather than a wolf, a long, thoughtful tail. 3 pairs of glowing dark blue eyes, set under 3 ridges of frost. It was in the classroom on the 2nd floor, the size of a small bear. The boggart in the wooden box across the room made one small unhappy sound and tried, with the small unsuccessful courage of a boggart that has misjudged the room, to back into the corner of its own box. The Cerberus of Stygian frost looked, with 3 pairs of dark blue eyes, at the boggart. The middle head very slowly lowered. The boggart in its box gave up. It folded with the same wet cloth fold the Dementor at Privet Drive had folded with, and was, after 2 seconds, gone. The box itself on the desk where Lupin had set it, frosted slightly along the wood grain. Harry, on his side of the classroom, lowered his wand. The Cerberus of Stygian frost in the air above him did not this time dissolve. It held. It looked, with 3 pairs of thoughtful blue eyes, at its boy. The middle head, with the precision of a creature that had been formed by dream instruction across 2 years of nights, walked, very gently, in the air, over to Harry. It bowed its great frost-ridged head. It touched, just for a second, its enormous cold forehead to Harry's small living one. Harry, with the unguarded smile he had been saving for moments he had earned, said very quietly in Greek, "Hello." The 3 heads in the air turned together and looked with 3 pairs of pale blue eyes at Remus Lupin. Lupin was on his feet. He was, Harry noticed in the corner of his vision, very pale. He was holding by his side very tightly, his own wand lowered. He was not, by Harry's careful glance, afraid. He was recognizing. He said, in the small, soft voice of a man who had read a great deal of unusual books in the early years of his loneliness, "Harry, yes, Professor. That is not a Patronus. It is, Professor. It is the one I have. I was told it would be this one." Told by whom? Harry, in the classroom, looked at Lupin. He looked at the 3 frostbright heads still standing courteously in the air. He looked at his own wand. He looked last at his teacher, who was 33 and tired and gentle and the friend of his dead father. He breathed in, he breathed out. He said with the small unguarded honesty he had been preparing in his own slow way to deploy on this man one day, and which he had decided in the moment was today, "Professor, please sit down. The tea is going cold. I have something to tell you. I think you have a right to hear it. I think you will not be a stranger to most of what I am about to say. I think you will know parts of it already. I will tell you, please, the whole thing." He glanced at the Cerberus, which was beginning, with the small, obliging courtesy of a creature that knew when its boy was about to have a long conversation he would prefer to have one-on-one, to dissolve. It dissolved slowly. It dissolved as if regretful. When the last of the cold blue mist had cleared, the classroom was, once again, simply a classroom. The boggart was gone. The wooden box was, by accident, lightly frosted in a pattern that looked like a long, thin paw print on the lid. Lupin sat down. With careful hands he poured 2 new cups of tea. He passed one to Harry. He took one for himself. He folded his hands in his lap. He said, "All right, Harry, I am listening. I have for a number of years been wondering. You may begin where you like." Harry began at the beginning. He told Lupin about Lily, about Hecate, about the basket and the goddess who had given his mother to the woman in Cokeworth. About what Lily had been, what kind of magic she had really had, and how it had differed, by small invisible degrees, from the magic the wizards thought she had. He told him about the wood north of Inverness on Beltane in 1979, in the small, careful terms he had been taught to use about such things, with the small, careful brevity of a son who has been told he may speak of his parents but should not in either direction exaggerate. He told him about Hades, about the cottage, about the night of Halloween in 1981, about the shadow on the cot, about the soul fragment behind his scar, about the dream corridor, about the cupboard. About the lessons, about Mr. Cuddles, about the Dementor in the back garden, about Quirrell, about the jar in the cupboard 6 shelves deep in a palace under the ground. He talked in the small, unobtrusive way he had learned for almost an hour. Lupin did not interrupt. When Harry was finished, Lupin set his tea down. He had, by the 3rd paragraph, stopped reaching for it. His hands were folded in his lap. He had not, by any of his usual tells, moved. He said after a long, careful silence, "Harry." "Yes, Professor." "Thank you." "Yes, Professor. I have, as you guessed, suspected some of this. Lily was a friend. She was a very dear friend. She and I, in the year before the end, had a number of conversations she would not have had with anyone but me. She did not, in fact, tell me. But she told me enough that I could, in my own small, slow way, put pieces together. I had, in particular, been wondering all these years about a small dark stone in a velvet pouch. She had shown it to me once. She had said only that it was the gift of a friend and that I was not to ask. I did not ask. I have, since her death, sometimes wondered. Harry, on his side of the desk, said, "Aunt Petunia thinks Dumbledore took it." "He did," said Lupin. "I am almost certain of it. He has in his office a small black stone in a velvet bag in his second drawer down. I have seen it. I have not, in respect for him, asked. We will in time ask. There is no hurry." "Yes, Professor." There was a pause. Lupin said, "Harry, I will ask you one thing only. I will ask you what your father, what Hades, wishes of me." Harry, with the small, unguarded smile he had been saving for moments he had earned, said, He wishes you to be my defense against the dark arts teacher, Professor. That's all. He has the highest regard for you. He says you have looked death in the face several times in your life and not on any of them turned away from her. He says, these are his words, sir, that you are exactly the right teacher for me and that he is in your debt, sir, for what you taught my father about loyalty when they were young. Lupin, in his chair, sat very still. It is one of the small private records of Remus Lupin's life that he did not, on that afternoon, in front of his student, cry. He waited until he was alone in his rooms that evening, with a glass of indifferent brandy and a small fire on the hearth, before he allowed himself even one quiet, long breath in. But in the moment in his classroom in front of his student, he did the thing his Lily had taught him, 12 years earlier, to do in moments of overwhelm. He set his hands on his knees, breathed once, and smiled. He said, in the small, steady voice of a man who knew he was being trusted, "Tell him I am honored." Harry, with the small, steady smile of a boy who was honored to pass the message, said, "Yes, Professor, I will tell him tonight." The matter of Sirius Black came to a head in the spring of that same year, and it came, as such things did in those years, in a way the official records would later have to do a great deal of work to reconcile. Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban in the previous summer. The Ministry, in the small panicked language of organizations that have been embarrassed, had been broadcasting his picture in the streets of every wizarding settlement in Britain since August. There were not, in any of those pictures, 3 pertinent facts. The first pertinent fact was that Sirius Black had not, in 1981, betrayed James and Lily Potter to Voldemort. He had been the obvious choice for Secret Keeper, and he had, in the small panicked language of the days before the Fidelius charm was set, persuaded James to switch the office to Peter Pettigrew at the last minute, on the grounds that Pettigrew was the kind of weedy, unremarkable man no one would think to torture. The switch had been made in private. No one outside the 4 of them, Sirius, James, Lily, and Pettigrew himself, had been told. Pettigrew, who had been a Death Eater spy for over a year by then, had walked the secret straight to Voldemort the following week. The arrangement, in other words, had been a clever idea proposed by a loyal man and exploited by the rat in their midst. The second pertinent fact was that Sirius Black had spent 12 years in Azkaban with this knowledge intact, because his Patronus form, a great black dog of the kind that, in old Scotland, walked at the elbow of certain pre-Christian gods, had let him preserve his sanity in the cell in a way that no other inmate of Azkaban had managed. He had escaped the previous summer not because he had snapped, but because he had read, in a newspaper photograph passed in by a guard who had pitied him, the back of a hand of a Weasley boy, on which sat a tame rat with a missing toe. The missing toe had been the toe Pettigrew had cut off himself, on the day he had framed Sirius for his own murder, in the street in 1981. The third pertinent fact was that Hades, the Lord of the Pit, had a long-standing low opinion of frauds of all kinds, but a particularly poor opinion of frauds who had played dead to escape their own crimes, on the grounds that they were, in his professional terminology, abusing the brand. This last fact would, in the summer of Harry's third year, become operative. Sirius Black, in his animagus form, made his way to Hogwarts at the end of May. He had been in the previous months increasingly close to a small thin black dog seen, by various witnesses, lurking around the edges of Hogsmeade. He had been in his own way trying to find his godson. Mr. Cuddles, who was in the practice of patrolling the edges of the Forbidden Forest in the small hours of the morning under his master's standing instructions, had encountered Sirius's small black dog on a Thursday in early March, on a deer trail outside the boundary. He had in his great quiet way paused. He had in his great quiet way looked at the small black dog. He had in his great quiet way smelled it. He had, with the careful old courtesy of a creature of Hades, recognized in the small thin grimy black dog before him, not a hostile but a kin, a creature whose animagus form had been blessed, 3 generations back, by an obscure Scottish hedge-priest of the older pantheon, and whose blood on the dog level was therefore distantly cousin to his own. Mr. Cuddles had, on the deer trail in March, knelt. He had lowered his 3 heads, for he had, by then, the standard Cerberus configuration, kept ordinarily folded down to one for surface convenience, and bowed. Sirius Black, in his animagus form, in the moonlight on a deer trail outside Hogsmeade, had stood for a long second in confused disbelief at being bowed to by a hellhound the size of a small horse, and then with the smallest of his old dog smiles had bowed back. They had walked, the rest of that night, side by side, into the small folded shadow at the foot of an old oak tree, where Mr. Cuddles had been permitted, by his master, to bring a kinsman in need of shelter. Sirius had not, in the safety of that shadow, transformed back. He had simply slept. For the first time in the dim warmth of a creature of his cousin line, he had slept the deep, dreamless sleep that he had not slept since he was a boy. He had that night also been visited. He had not on first inspection known that he was being visited. He had simply, while sleeping in the shadow at the foot of the oak, had a long quiet conversation in dream with a tall pale man in a charcoal coat. The tall pale man had said, "Mr. Black, my name is Hades. I believe you and I have not met. I have, however, known your godson for some time. He is, in fact, though it is not in his school record, my son." Sirius, in dream, had said, "Oh, I am sorry to inform you," the man had continued, "that the events of the war did not, in the year after Lily's death, go exactly as the wizarding world has recorded them. I have, on your goddaughter's behalf, that is, on Lily's behalf, been pursuing a small private investigation into certain of those events. I have found, with the help of certain administrative resources unavailable to the wizards, an answer that may interest you. I have in particular located the soul of one Peter Pettigrew." Sirius, in dream, had said, "He's not dead. No, he is not. I know that. I am, however, the god of the dead. I have in my realm the records of every soul that ever lived, irrespective of whether the body is, at any given moment, still walking around. I have in the file of one Peter Pettigrew a deposition. I took it on the night Lily died on a small technical formality I will not bore you with. The deposition is the testimony of his soul, given under the duress of certain ritual procedures that, while not, by my standards, painful, are extremely truthful. It is, in short, a confession. It is signed by the small thumbprint of his soul. It is admissible in any court that has any interest in the truth." Sirius, in dream, had stared. He had said in a small, spent voice, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because, Mr. Black, my son is fond of you. He has not met you. He has, however, looked, by the small interior sight he is developing, at the records I keep on his father James and on his father's friends, and he has, on the strength of the records, formed an attachment to you. He would like, in particular, for his godfather to be free, alive, and on speaking terms with the ministry. He has asked me, as is his right, to assist. I am, on his behalf, assisting. How? I will, at a time of my choosing, in approximately 2 months, when my son finishes his school year, deposit the confession of Peter Pettigrew's soul in the official record of the Ministry of Magic, by a means that will leave no question of its provenance. I will, in addition, send to that ministry a temporary form of the rat himself, transformed in such a way that he can be examined for the missing toe, and held and tried. Your name will be cleared. Your godson will, in the summer, come to live with you. You will, however, do me one favor in return. Sirius, in dream, had said, name it. You will, when my son comes to live with you, be his godfather, Mr. Black, not his father. He has a father, he has, in fact, two. He has had for some years an excellent stepfather in the form of his Aunt Petunia, who has done a better job than the wizarding world will ever credit her with. He does not, however, have a godfather of the running, laughing, trouble-making kind. He needs one. He needs you in particular in the precise role you were intended for. You will not, please, when you have him in your house, attempt to be more to him than that. You will leave the heavy bookkeeping of fatherhood to me. You will, in exchange, have him in your house, very much alive, very much yours, until the day he leaves it to make his own. Do you accept the terms? Sirius in dream had laughed once. It had been a small wet laugh. He had said, I accept the terms. Good, sleep, Mr. Black. He had slept. He had woken on the morning after in his ordinary thin grimy black dog form on a bed of leaves at the foot of an old oak in the forbidden forest. He had been, for the first time in 12 years, warm. Mr. Cuddles, beside him, had been napping. The small horse-sized hellhound had been, at that moment, mistaken by any passing acromantula for a small black hill. The thing was managed, in the end, on the eve of the last day of term. It was managed in the small fastidious style of the gods, which is to say, with no fanfare and a great deal of paperwork. The official version, as it would later appear in the ministry's record, was that an anonymous deposition, of a kind so unusual it would be discussed in journals of magical jurisprudence for a decade, had appeared in the inbox of Amelia Bones, the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The deposition was sealed with a wax sigil that no wizard in living memory had been able to identify. It was, when broken, the testimony of one Peter Pettigrew, attested under conditions the deposition itself described, in cool factual language, as the second oath of the river that records oaths, which the small classical scholars at the department recognized with quiet dismay as the Styx. The deposition contained, in 5 pages of small, precise handwriting, the entire confession. It described the years of Pettigrew's tenure as a spy. It described the day he was made secret keeper. It described the way he had given the secret to Voldemort. It described in dry, plain language the explosion in the street, the cut-off finger, the framing of Sirius, the transformation into a rat, the 12 years among the Weasleys. It described in a small confessional postscript what Pettigrew had felt about it. It was not a long postscript. It was, by all accounts of the eventually leaked record, the most damning passage in the document, for it was the postscript in which Pettigrew, in his own voice, said the thing he had not said to himself in 12 years, that he had known, the whole time, what he had done. The deposition was accompanied, in the same envelope, by a single small gray rat. The rat had been delivered in a small carved bone box on Madame Bones's desk overnight. The rat was unconscious. The rat had a missing toe. The rat was identified by the standard animagus reversal spell within 10 minutes of its arrival as Peter Pettigrew. He had not, on being roused, by any means available to him, been able to claim otherwise. He had screamed. He had begged. He had, as is sometimes the case in such moments, wet himself. He had been confined to a holding cell, and a trial had been convened on emergency procedure within 4 days. Sirius Black, in the meantime, had walked into the Ministry of Magic on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, in a moth-eaten old coat over a clean white shirt that Mr. Cuddles, on his master's instructions, had procured by some means no one ever asked about, and turned himself in. He had been arrested with great speed and minimal violence by 3 Aurors who had by then been told to expect him. He had 20 minutes later, in the office of Amelia Bones, been allowed to read the deposition. He had laughed once in a small wet laugh, the way he had laughed in the dream under the oak. He had said, Madam Bones, may I please testify? He had testified. He had, in the course of his testimony, in a calm, collected, steady voice he had not had access to in 12 years, told her the entire story. By Friday of the same week, Sirius Black was a free man, with an enormous ministry-issued formal apology, a backdated pension from the Auror office, a great deal of compensation, and the small private satisfaction of having seen, in the holding cell on the way out, the rat Peter Pettigrew, restored to human form, kneeling on the stone floor in irons. Sirius had paused at the bars of the cell. He had looked at Pettigrew for a long second. He had said very gently, with the dryness that was the small particular signature of the Black family at their best, Wormtail, old friend, hello. Pettigrew on the stone floor had not been able to answer. Sirius at the bars had said, I will not in fact kill you. I had a long conversation about that recently with a man I had not met before, and he persuaded me that it was a privilege I should not assume. You are not, however, going to enjoy what is coming. He has had your soul on file for 12 years, Wormtail. I am sorry. I am, in fact, only a little sorry. He had turned. He had walked at his own pace in his own time to the lift. He had ridden it up. He had walked with the small, light step of a man who had not, in 12 years, walked anywhere without a guard, out of the Ministry of Magic. He had stood for a moment on the cobblestones of the atrium. He had looked briefly up at the ceiling, where in dim daylight a small, thin shadow lay at an angle the ordinary architecture did not justify. He had nodded once. The shadow had, on review, nodded back. He had walked out of the ministry. Harry met Sirius for the first time, in waking life, at the gates of Hogwarts on the morning of June the 20th. Sirius had borrowed, for the occasion, a respectable navy traveling cloak from a tailor in Hogsmeade and a small black hat to match. He looked in his cloak and his hat, like a slightly raffish young uncle who had wandered into the small village by mistake. He was 33. He had, in the previous 2 weeks, eaten more in a single sitting than he had eaten in any of the previous 12 years. He was, by the careful work of Madame Pomfrey and the small private interventions of Remus Lupin and the very large hot meals of the cook at the Hog's Head, 12 pounds heavier than he had been at his trial. His hair, which had been a long, greasy gray, had been cut and washed and was now, once again, dark. He stood at the gates with his hands in the pockets of his cloak. Harry, in his school robes, came down the long drive. They had not, and this was, against all expectation, the small particular grace of the morning, they had not at any point agreed in advance on the script of their meeting. Harry at the gates said, in a small, steady voice, "Hello, sir." Sirius at the gates said, in a slightly cracked voice that he had been practicing in his bathroom for 45 minutes that morning, "Hello, Harry." There was a small silence. Then Sirius, with the unguarded grin that had been the small particular property of Sirius Black at his 16-year-old best, and which had not, since 1981, appeared on his face, but which, in the morning light at the gates of Hogwarts at the end of June 1994, came back in a great unrolling, said, "Right, hug now. We'll handle the rest of it later. Come here, you." Harry, at 13, in his school robes, with his small trunk on a wheeled cart behind him, with Mr. Cuddles in shadow over his left shoulder and his Cerberus Patronus, dormant in his wand, and his Shadowfather, somewhere very far below them, watching, with the small dry approval of the Lord of Accounts, Harry stepped forward and let his godfather wrap him in arms that had been waiting 12 years. He did not, to his credit, cry. He did when Sirius pulled back to hold him at arm's length and look at him properly, for the first time in waking light, lift his small chin and look up at his godfather with the small unguarded green-eyed honesty he had been saving for the small particular set of people he had been told, in advance, were worth it. He said, with the small careful Surrey courtesy he had inherited from his aunt, "I'm very pleased to meet you, sir." Sirius, with the grin that had not yet stopped, said, "Pleased to meet me, formally, you cheeky little thing. Right, trunk in the cart. We're walking to the village. There's a cab. There's a house in London, very large, very full of dust, very full of old portraits I'm going to introduce you to and then immediately apologize for, very full of bedrooms you may have your pick of. There's also a stag-headed door knocker my mother had installed in 1958 that I have been wanting for 35 years to throw into the river. We will do that together. Mr. Cuddles. Yes, hello, mate. You may, of course, come with us. I've been told by your master to give you, on arrival at the house, a steak as big as your head. Yes, I see you. Harry, are you ready?" Harry, at 13, at the gates of Hogwarts, with the morning light on his face, said, "Yes, sir." He took his godfather's hand. They walked together down the lane. Behind them, in the shadow of the gate-post, the long, thin shape of his Shadowfather lay, briefly, at an angle the morning sun did not justify, and watched them go. Hades, in the privacy of his palace, made one small note in the ledger. It said, "My son has a godfather." The ledger on his desk gave, in its old quiet way, a small approving creak. He picked up the next file. Chapter 6, The Dragon Who Bowed, and the Resurrection That Failed the Triwizard Tournament was, by ancient design, a contest of 3. It had been, in its medieval inception, a competition of pure spectacle, mounted by a triumvirate of European magical schools eager to settle, every 5 years, the perennial question of whose 7th years could most spectacularly fail to die during a series of public ordeals. By the late 20th century, the spectacle had become more managed and rather less reliably fatal, but the structure had not changed. One champion from each of the 3 schools, 3 tasks, and a great deal of small-scale international betting in alleys behind the wizarding bookmakers' shops in 9 countries. By long tradition, the Goblet of Fire selected the champions, and by long tradition, the Goblet of Fire was a piece of magical machinery that knew its own business and could not, on any account, be tampered with by amateurs. It was, of course, tampered with that year. The tampering had been a small, careful piece of work by a man pretending to be Alistair Moody, whose true name had been Barty Crouch Jr., and whose true vocation had been the small private service of Lord Voldemort, who had been, by the autumn of Harry's 4th year, restored to a kind of half-existence and was preparing the larger one. The Crouch impostor had submitted, into the goblet, a 4th piece of parchment containing the name of a 4th school, under the small confundus charm necessary to persuade an old enchanted goblet that a 4th school had always been part of the contest. He had submitted, under the name of that 4th school, the name of one student. The student was Harry James Potter, of Hogwarts School, Slytherin House, 4th year. The plan had been on the impostor's part that the goblet would, by its own logic, select that student as a champion. The tournament rules, drawn up by the same medieval wizards who had thought spectacle a reasonable substitute for safety, were magically binding. Once selected, a champion could not, under the formal rules, withdraw. The plan had been in the longer run that the boy would be steered, by way of 3 increasingly dangerous tasks, to the 3rd one, which would conclude in a graveyard in Little Hangleton, where a ritual involving certain ingredients, including the blood of an enemy, would restore the Dark Lord to bodily form. It was a clever plan. It was, by the small private standards of its author, almost a beautiful one. It had only one flaw, which was that the Lord of the Pit had been watching it from approximately the moment Crouch Jr., in late September, had first sat at his small desk in the false Moody's quarters and begun, with the small precise satisfaction of a craftsman, to draft it. The goblet, on the appointed evening, spat out 4 names instead of 3. The great hall had, on the night of the choosing, been packed to the doors. Dumbledore had read out the first 3 names, Crumb from Durmstrang, Delacour from Beauxbatons, Diggory from Hogwarts, to the customary applause, and had then been about to make his closing remarks when the goblet had, with an unhappy lurch, produced a 4th piece of parchment. The parchment had come out smoking. Dumbledore had caught it. He had read it. He had paused. In the small private exchange of glances that had then taken place between Dumbledore and McGonagall, and at the Slytherin table, the deputy head of Slytherin House, who was, that year, Severus Snape, Harry, on his bench, had felt his shadow father, very briefly, in the back of his head. The sensation had been the small dry one of a god checking a watch. The voice in his head had said, quietly, "Stand up, Harry. Be calm. We have him." Harry had stood up. He had walked in his measured Slytherin way, the length of the great hall, with his housemates' eyes on him, and Draco Malfoy's small unhappy clenching jaw, and Hermione's small worried frown from across the room at the Gryffindor table. Hermione had transferred herself out of Ravenclaw in 2nd year by a procedure no one had ever quite explained, but which had had, on McGonagall's quiet authority, the support of 3 professors and Ron's blanched freckles, and the small ambient hum of 700 surprised witches and wizards. He had reached the front of the hall. He had said, in his small, steady voice, to Dumbledore, "Sir, I did not put my name in this cup." Dumbledore, in the soft, careful voice of a man who had not quite, in the small private accounts of his own mind, been expecting the boy in question to be a Slytherin. "I know, Harry. I am, however, told you will have to compete. I am sorry. Please go through the door behind me. The other champions are waiting." Harry had bowed briefly, with the small, careful courtesy he had been raised to give to certain officials, and had gone through the door. In the antechamber, the 3 other champions had turned to look at him. Cedric Diggory, who was an extremely fair-minded Hufflepuff 7th year, had said, "Bad luck, Potter. Is this on purpose?" Harry, with the small, steady honesty he had learned to deploy on people of certain categories, had said, "No, Cedric, it is not. Someone has done it. I do not yet know who. I am sorry. I will try not to be in the way." Cedric had, with the small, straightforward Hufflepuff generosity that would, in the year to come, save his life. "All right, I believe you." Fleur Delacour and Victor Crumb had, with the small, careful, professional formality of older champions, shaken his hand. Crumb had said, "Small but eyes older than face. We will see, Mr. Potter. The first task was dragons." Dragons, in the small private opinion of Hades, which Harry had received in dream the week before the task, were creatures with a great many sensible instincts, including a sensible instinct about creatures of certain other categories. Dragons, in particular, had no quarrel with creatures of the underworld. They were too old to bother. They were, by long ancient agreement, neutral in the matter of death's accounts, and they were, by long ancient agreement, courteous to death's officers when those officers turned up unannounced. "You will not, Harry," his shadow father had said in the dream kitchen with the stew on the stove, need to do anything elaborate for this task. You will need only to walk into the arena. The dragon will recognize you. The dragon will, in front of 7,000 witnesses, not fight you. The dragon will, in particular, be the Hungarian horntail, which is the worst-tempered of the four. The horntail will be, by some small irony, the most courteous to you of the four, because it is the oldest and it remembers in its bones the old terms. You will walk to the egg. You will pick it up. You will walk back. You will not please do anything dramatic. You will not please smile at the dragon. The dragon will not smile back. You will only in passing nod to it. It will nod back. The crowd will be very confused. I will, in the small private satisfaction of my office, enjoy the confusion. Do you understand? Yes, father. Take the egg out of the nest gently. The dragon will be sitting on its own real eggs as well as the false golden one. The real ones are not yours. Be careful of them. Yes, father. You will, in the small, steady comfort of your housemates, be more popular for this than you imagine. Be modest, Harry. Be unshowy. Take your moment. Walk back. Smile only at your friends. Do not gloat. Yes, father. He did not gloat. In the arena on the morning of the first task, in front of 7,000 witches and wizards and a great many small, terrified, gold-rosetted fourth years, Harry James Potter, fourth year, Slytherin, with his yew wand in his pocket and Mr. Cuddles, by his shadow father's express instruction, sitting on his haunches in the deep shadow of the high wooden tier at the back of the spectators' stand, walked at his own steady pace to the center of the arena. The Hungarian horntail, 5 tons of irritable black-spined dragon, with a clutch of real eggs underneath her and one false golden one tucked in among them, turned her great head when he entered. Her gold eyes narrowed. She lowered her snout, opened her mouth, and prepared, by the small irritated reflex of a mother dragon protecting her clutch, to vaporize the small Slytherin third year in the middle of her arena. She did not. She did not because, in the small held second between her opening her mouth and her releasing her fire, she got, on her tongue, the small unmistakable taste of the air around the small Slytherin third year, and the taste was the taste of wood smoke and old Stygian ice, and the dragon, who was 412 years old, and had in her great long life met 2 creatures of his line, and had on both occasions declined to engage them, closed her mouth. She lowered her great spined head. She did not, by any honest reading of the rules of the task, bow. She did, however, lower her head to a degree that even Dumbledore in the judge's tent, with his careful, long-trained eyes, registered. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, gave out a small, confused murmur. Harry, in the middle of the arena, paused. He inclined his head, in the small, careful way his shadow father had taught him to incline his head to creatures of her age and standing. He said, in a small, calm voice that did not carry much past the third row, but which the dragon, with her old precise hearing, would have caught at a mile, "Madam, I am here for the gold one only. The clutch is yours. I will be quick. Thank you for your patience." The dragon, in a small, precise click of her great gold eyes, blinked at him. She moved very slightly to one side. In the eggs beneath her, the false golden one was now visible, lying on top of the real ones. Harry, with the small, careful courtesy of a boy who had been raised in part by a god of accounts, knelt on the sand of the arena in front of her clutch. He did not even take out his wand. He reached with his own ordinary 13-year-old hand and lifted the false golden egg off the clutch. He stood up. He inclined his head again, slightly. The dragon, slowly, returned her great head to her clutch. She settled. She turned her gold eyes briefly on Harry's small, retreating back, and gave, in her own way, a small dragon nod. Harry walked, in his measured Slytherin way, back across the arena. The crowd, by the time he reached the gate, had finally begun to clap. The clap had been hesitant at first. It had grown, by the time he stepped through the gate, into a kind of roar. In the judge's tent on the long bench, Madame Maxime, who had seen in her long life 2 species of dragon and had not been entirely sure that this was not, in fact, an Albanian elf bull, was now staring at the small Slytherin fourth year with the open expression of a Frenchwoman who had been forced, against her training, to revise. Karkaroff, who hated him on principle, had grown several shades paler. Crouch, the impostor, had not moved. Bagmans, who had no idea what had happened, was clapping wildly. Dumbledore, who had a great many ideas about what had happened and had been quietly running through several of them in his head, had the small particular expression he reserved for moments at which his own theories were not, as he had hoped, complete. Snape, on the high tier, had given Harry a slow nod that no one else had seen. Harry, in the small holding room, set the gold egg down on the table. Mr. Cuddles, in shadow in the corner, gave one short approving snort. The first task was over. The scoring, when announced, put Harry in joint first. The second task was the lake. It was, on the strict reading of the rules, the kind of task that ought to have given a son of Hades a great deal of trouble. The merpeople of the Black Lake had been there for 1,000 years. They were old, they were proud, they had among themselves very particular politics, and they had, in their long history, not had especially warm relations with the gods of the older pantheons. The lake itself was, in its deeper places, the kind of cold that would, by ordinary measurements, have given even an excellent Patronus a hard time. The task had been designed, by the impostor on the judging committee, to be the one in which something would, if necessary, go quietly wrong. The hostages tied at the bottom of the lake were to be the people each champion would most miss. Harry's hostage was to have been his godfather. He had been brought, with no warning to him, in a quiet and almost discourteous way, by a man pretending to be a courier of the Department of Magical Games and Sports. When the courier had arrived at Grimmauld Place on a Wednesday afternoon, with the small false official papers in his hand and the small false courteous smile, Sirius Black had opened the door, looked the man calmly up and down, said, "I would like, please, to speak with my flu first, sir, on the matter of an unrelated case," and shut the door in his face. He had then walked into the drawing room of Grimmauld Place, stood in front of the fireplace, taken a pinch of flu powder, said, "Hogwarts School, the dungeon office of Professor Snape," and stuck his head into the green flames. This was the second of the small, great, quiet acts of the year that no one in the school would ever know about. Sirius Black, in the autumn of 1994, with great misgiving but with the cool, steady judgment of a man who had, in the previous summer, signed a contract with the Lord of the Pit, was using Severus Snape as a back channel. He had given Snape, briefly, the courier's name. He had explained the false papers. He had said, "Severus, I do not know what is going on. I do know that the request on its face is irregular. I would please like you to walk down the corridor to the false Moody's quarters, knock on his door, and inquire after a courier whose name is not, as far as the department's own records go, on the payroll. I would please like to know, before I sleep at the bottom of any lake on Saturday, who is fishing for me." Snape, with the small private contempt he had for Sirius Black and the small private respect he had for the operational sense of the request, had said, "All right, Black, I will look," flew back in 20 minutes. He had looked. The courier on the official departmental list did not exist. Snape had reported 20 minutes later, in the small, careful voice of a man passing information to an old enemy, "Black, he is a Crouch operative. I do not yet know who's Crouch." Sirius, in his drawing room, had said, "I will not then go to the lake. I will, with your permission, send a substitute." What substitute? "There is a creature of my godson's acquaintance," Sirius had said dryly, "who is, I believe, willing and able to be tied to a chair at the bottom of a lake in place of a man for an afternoon. He will, I gather, find the whole experience extremely funny. He has been wanting, his master tells me, an outing." Snape had paused. He had said in the small, dry voice of a man revising his estimate of the universe, "Black, are you proposing to substitute as a hostage a hellhound?" "Yes, Severus." There had been on Snape's end of the line a small held silence. Snape had said, "Black, I do not, for the record, approve. For the wider record, I also do not, by any reasonable wizarding standard, mind, send him." "Thank you, Severus." On the morning of the second task, when the 4 champions stood in their swimming things on the wooden pier above the cold lake, and were each told who their hostage was, Crumbs was his current young lady, a Bulgarian classmate. Cedric's was Cho Chang, the Ravenclaw he had been quietly seeing. Fleur's was her small sister Gabrielle. Harry was told in a small, careful announcement by Bagman that the hostage who would be most missed by him had proven, at the last minute, unavailable, and that, by emergency substitution, the hostage tied at the bottom of the lake for him would be a member of his household animal staff. Harry, who had not been told any of this, paused briefly on the pier. He felt in the back of his head his shadow father with the small, precise warmth of a god who was, in his private palace, very near to laughing. The voice in Harry's head said in dry Greek, "Your godfather sends his regards. He has sent Mr. Cuddles in his place." Mr. Cuddles is, at this moment, tied to a chair at the bottom of the lake, looking, I am told, very pleased with himself. Take your time. He is comfortable. He has been promised, on his return, a roast. Harry on the pier gave a small, unguarded grin that the crowd, on its own measurement, would interpret afterward as the cocky confidence of a 14-year-old with too much front. He pocketed his gillyweed, the same gillyweed he had been secretly given by a small, awkward house elf the night before, a gift the impostor on the staff had carefully arranged through intermediaries, and dove very neatly into the water. He swam, in a state of mild, amused affection, the long, slow journey down to the bottom of the Black Lake, while the merpeople, who had been informed by their own ancient channels of who had entered their water, gave him a wider berth than they were giving the other champions. At the bottom, tied with great care to the central post of the underwater holding area, was a small gray stone chair on which sat, in the form he had grown into for ceremonial purposes, which was a perfectly ordinary-looking large black dog the size of a horse, with 3 folded heads, all of which were currently wagging their tongues, Mr. Cuddles. Beside him, on the chairs reserved for the other hostages, were Hermione Granger Crumbs, which surprised Harry briefly, but he registered it without judgment, as Crumb had clearly developed in the Autumn Library an extremely respectful regard for her, Cho Chang Cedrics, and Gabrielle Delacour Fleurs. Mr. Cuddles, on his ceremonial perch, looked up at his master coming through the dim water. His 3 pairs of red ember eyes in the cold green underwater light gave a small banked glow of pure delight. Harry, with the gillyweed making his small breath bubble in 3 slow streams, swam down to him. He laid one hand on the great wide flat black skull. He whispered in his small private Greek, "Hello, you, comfortable." Mr. Cuddles gave, even underwater, one small approving snort. Harry untied him. They rose, dog and boy, in a slow, easy spiral, past the still merpeople, past the kelp forest, past the great cold deep of the lake's heart, up to the bright cold morning surface of the world. They surfaced together, the small 4th year and the small horse-sized hellhound, in front of the entire spectator stand. The crowd, which had been waiting for one boy and a hostage, did not know what to do. Harry, treading water in the cold, kept his arm casually around Mr. Cuddles's neck. He said, with the small, unguarded honesty he had reserved for the small, particular set of moments at which it was earned, "He's mine, sir. He came up with me." Bagman at the judge's bench, his head tilted, made a slightly strangled sound. Dumbledore beside him made the small, precise, polite cough that in Dumbledore was the equivalent of another man slapping his knee. The judges scored him at the top of the second task. Mr. Cuddles on the pier shook himself once. The spray hit, more or less by his own gentle design, the impostor playing Moody. The impostor, who had been standing innocently near the edge of the pier with his small false official papers in his hand, was wetted from his false eye to his false boot. He smiled, falsely, and pretended to clap. Harry, with one hand on Mr. Cuddles's collar, walked up the pier into his godfather's arms. The 3rd task, the maze, was the one the impostor had built his year toward. By the time of the 3rd task, Harry knew. He had not, until very late, known the impostor's name, but he had known that the small defense against the dark arts professor with the rolling magical eye had been, on his shadow father's private investigation, the wrong man. Hades had told him this in dream in early May. His real name, Harry, Hades had said, with the small, dry distaste of a god of accounts looking at a forgery, is Barty Crouch, Jr. He is the son, in fact, of the Crouch you have seen on the judge's bench. He has, for the past year, been impersonating the Auror Alistair Moody, the real version of whom is, at present, alive, but in a most uncomfortable trunk in a wardrobe in his own quarters. We will, in time, remove him from the wardrobe. We will not, however, do it yet. We have a use for the impostor's continued belief that his plan is working. The plan is, in short, to send you, by portkey, at the close of the 3rd task, to a graveyard in Little Hangleton. The graveyard contains the bones of one Tom Riddle Sr., the father of the man you and I have been quietly disassembling. In the graveyard, his servant Pettigrew, who, as you know, did not die in 1981, was before his arrest to perform a ritual that would restore his master to bodily form. The ritual requires, among other things, the blood of an enemy of the master. The blood was to be yours. Harry, in dream, had said, "Yes, father. You will please take the portkey at the end of the maze. You will please allow the ritual to go forward, as far as the point at which the rat is to add father's blood from the grave. You will not please allow it to proceed further than that. There is a reason. Pettigrew is, at the moment, in the holding cell of the ministry. There is, at the graveyard, no Pettigrew. There is instead a man pretending to be Pettigrew. He is a different small servant, named Augustus Rookwood, who has been quietly recruited by the impostor on the Hogwarts staff in the last weeks and trained to perform the ritual. He is, however, no Pettigrew. He is not the bond of long discipleship to your enemy. The ritual will, in consequence, not work as Voldemort hopes. But we will help it not work by the additional measure that on the night I will, by my own act, forbid the father's blood from leaving the bones in the grave. The bones are mine. They are in my realm. They are not, in fact, available to be used for any ritual. Yes, father, your enemy will, in consequence, appear in the graveyard in a half-formed state, a barely corporeal wraith in a kind of unhardened body, weak as a newborn. He will be very angry. He will, in his anger, attempt to summon his Death Eaters. They will come. He will attempt to duel you. You will please not duel him. You will instead do the following. You will save the boy. Cedric, father. Cedric, the other Hogwarts champion. You and he will both reach the cup at the same moment. He is, by a small unfair turn of the year, traveling with you to the graveyard. He must not, please, be killed there. You will, on stepping onto the soil of the graveyard, put your hand on his shoulder. Mr. Cuddles, who will be in your shadow, will, by my standing instruction, lay himself between Cedric and any spell sent by any party in the graveyard. Cedric will, in consequence, live. He may, in the days after, ask you questions. You may answer them. He is a good lad. He may be told. Yes, father. You will, after the ritual fails, take the cup back via portkey to the school. You will take Cedric. You will take Pettigrew, the false one, alive if possible. You will please allow Mr. Cuddles to take the imposter playing Moody, who will, in the moment of your return, be in a great hurry to silence you. Mr. Cuddles will be in the right place at the right time. He will not, on this occasion, kill the imposter. The imposter is wanted alive by Madame Bones. He will, however, very firmly remove the imposter from the room. Yes, father. And Harry, yes, father. The thing of which your enemy is going to be in greatest need on the night is the body. He will not have the body. He will have a body, but it will not be the body he wanted. He will not, in particular, have your blood. He will not, in particular, have the father's blood. He will have only the rat servant's blood, and the rat servant has not the bond to him to anchor him properly. He will be, when he stands up in that graveyard, a man on borrowed terms. You will please register that. You will please not engage him in any way except to leave. Yes, father, I will not engage. Good. The third task ran on the night of June 24th, very nearly to its imposter's design. The maze had, in the strict accounting, several monsters, several puzzles, and several small lethal magical inconveniences. Harry, who had been raised in part by a god of accounts and who had been doing his homework, dispatched each of them with the small, steady efficiency of a fourth year who had, in private, been receiving an extraordinary set of supplementary lessons. Cedric in the maze had been less lucky. He had been in the second hour attacked by a giant spider, and had been, by the time Harry arrived in the small dim circle around him, on the ground with a wounded knee. Harry had, with the small steady kindness he had been quietly building towards Cedric for 2 months, the careful, neat, unforced kindness of a Slytherin who had decided that this particular Hufflepuff was worth being kind to, helped him up. They had walked together the last 50 yards to the cup. You take it, Cedric, Harry had said. No, Potter, we take it together. We both got here, halfway. All right then, together. They had both reached for the cup. They had both taken it. They had both, simultaneously, in front of 7,000 witches and wizards behind the maze hedges, been jerked, with a single dizzy roar of magic, into the air. They had landed 10 seconds later in a graveyard. The graveyard was, on first inspection, a small, ordinary one. There were headstones. There was an iron fence. There was, at the center of the headstones, a particular grave with a large white memorial slab marked Tom Riddle Sr. Beside the slab stood, not Pettigrew, although Harry, on his shadow father's advance information, knew, a small frightened man with a hood and a cauldron and a wand. The man was Augustus Rookwood, the small failed Death Eater the imposter had recruited, trained for 2 months, and dispatched to the graveyard as a substitute for the rat. The man, on seeing the 2 boys arrive, did, by the small frightened script of his briefing, what he had been told to do. He raised his wand. He aimed, with the careful precision of a man who had been told, the killing curse at the boy on the right. That was Cedric. Mr. Cuddles, in the shadow at Harry's foot, did not need to be told twice. The killing curse, green and fast, was in mid-flight, absorbed by a small, precise patch of black hellhound shadow that stretched itself, by its master's standing instruction, into the precise shape of a flat shield in front of Cedric Diggory. The curse hit the shield. The shield, on contact, did not, in any visible way, react. The curse simply went into it and did not come out. Mr. Cuddles, in the shadow, absorbed it. It was not, by the standards of his own kind, anything he could not absorb. He had been, the previous summer, fed worse for breakfast. Cedric Diggory, with great clean luck, was alive. Harry, with his free hand on Cedric's shoulder and his small, steady wand at his side, said, in the small, calm voice he had been raised to use in particular kinds of moments, "Cedric, get behind that headstone. Stay there, don't come out, I will come for you." Cedric, who was a Hufflepuff 7th year, and had, in the small held second between life and death, been given a great deal of free education in the courtesy of the world, said, "Yes," and went behind the headstone. Harry walked forward into the open ring of the graveyard. The man at the cauldron, Rookwood, in his servant's hood, had been, by the failure of his curse, briefly frozen. He looked with bewilderment at the small 4th year approaching him. He did the only thing he had been trained to do. He began the ritual. He cut, very carefully, a piece of bone from the grave of Tom Riddle Sr. He cast it into the cauldron. The cauldron hissed. He paused. He waited. He cut, with a small grimace, the second ingredient, a piece of flesh from his own forearm. He cast it in. The cauldron hissed more loudly. He paused. He waited. He did not have a third ingredient. He had been told he would, on the moment, be able to take the third ingredient, blood, from Harry. He had been told by his briefer that the boy would be bound and immobilized by the small ritual ropes that would, on his arrival, leap up from the headstones around him. The ropes had, in fact, leapt up from the headstones. They had, on encountering Harry, gone limp with a small embarrassed pop. They were, by the careful standing instruction of the Lord of the Pit, prohibited from binding a son of his line in a graveyard that contained the bones of any of his subjects. The graveyard contained, of course, the bones of approximately 300 years of Little Hangleton residents. The ropes were, in consequence, deeply embarrassed. The man at the cauldron in his hood with his wand, with the cauldron hissing and the bone and the flesh in it, said in a small, frightened voice, "Boy, come here." I do not have a knife. Give me your hand." Harry, in the open ring of the graveyard, with Mr. Cuddles in shadow at his foot, said, "No, sir, I will not." The man stared at him. He said in the small, panicked voice of a man whose briefing has come to its limit, I am too, boy, I will kill you." "You will not, sir. You will not get the chance. The ritual you are performing has failed, sir. The bone is not yours to take. The bones of Tom Riddle Sr. are, by the standing register of my father, the Lord of the Pit, not available for transfer to any wizard ritual. They will, in a moment, depart the cauldron of their own accord. The flesh you have given of yourself will, regrettably, regrow on you. The cauldron will, in a moment, give a sad small hiss and the green light in it will go out. The ritual will fail. You will stand in this graveyard alone. There will be no Voldemort tonight, sir, and you will live, I would estimate, approximately 3.5 minutes longer if you do not put your wand down." The man in the graveyard did not put his wand down. He did, however, look in the small, frightened second after Harry's small, calm announcement at the cauldron. The cauldron, in the same second, did exactly the things Harry had said. The bone in the cauldron, with a small dry click, rose into the air, hovered and fell, with a small precise thump, back into the grave. The flesh, in a small wet pop, returned to the man's forearm. The cauldron, with a small embarrassed sigh, went out. Where the great dark figure of Lord Voldemort had been on the verge of forming, in a tall, ragged, red-eyed body, there was now only a small, thin wisp of smoke, hovering in confused exhaustion above the dead cauldron. The wisp opened, by some small last reserve of will, its tiny red-eyed face. It looked with the awful slow hatred of a soul fragment that knew it had been outmaneuvered, at Harry across the graveyard. It said in its small spent voice, "Boy." You cannot. "I can, sir," said Harry in the same small calm voice. "I have in fact already done it. Good night, sir. We will see each other once more in approximately an hour. You will, I am afraid, not enjoy that meeting either." The wisp screamed, in its small spent way, and was, by no power of Harry's, but by the small precise hand of the Lord of the Pit, reaching up through the graveyard soil, gathered, like a wet handkerchief being lifted from a bowl into the air and put away. Where it was put away was not, on this occasion, into a bone jar. It was put away into a small dark holding pen 6 shelves deep in a palace under the ground, which contained, by now, 5 jars. The 5 jars were the 5 missing fragments of Tom Marvolo Riddle's soul. The 6th was, by Hades's standing arrangement, behind the small lightning scar on the small forehead of his own son. The 7th, the wraith, had just been added to the pen. In the graveyard, the small frightened man Rookwood, with his wand pointed at a small Slytherin 4th year who had just dismantled, in 2 minutes of calm conversation, the ritual he had spent 2 months learning, made the small frightened decision of his life. He turned to run. He did not get 3 steps before Mr. Cuddles, in the shadow at Harry's foot, with the small unhurried courtesy of a hellhound understanding orders, padded after him, took him gently by the back of the cloak with one set of jaws, and laid him with the small soft thud of a sack of laundry on the ground. He did not, by his master's careful instruction, harm him. He sat on him. Harry, at the open ring of the graveyard, said, "Cedric, come out, please. The cup. Where is the cup?" Cedric, behind the headstone, came out. The cup, by careful design of its enchantments, was a 2-way portkey. They both touched it. In the graveyard, in the moment before the portkey took them, Harry paused. He looked briefly at the open grave of Tom Riddle Sr. He inclined his head slightly. He said in a small, clear voice, "Thank you, sir. We have not met. I am sorry your son was the way he was. He is, I hope, finished now. Sleep well." The grave in the dim graveyard made, in the small held second of silence, no movement, but the soil at its head in a small private way lay an inch lower than before as if exhaled. The portkey took them. They landed 10 seconds later, in front of 7,000 witches and wizards, on the lawn outside the maze, with the cup between them, and Mr. Cuddles on the lawn, with Rookwood under his enormous black paws. It is a matter of historical record that the impostor on the staff did, on seeing this scene, attempt to silence Harry by apparating with him to a nearby spot under the cover of confusion. It is, however, also a matter of record, quietly recorded in the long, careful pen of Madame Bones, in the days afterward, that the impostor, in raising his wand, was, by a small, precise, unseen movement of a shadow on the lawn, restrained. Mr. Cuddles, in his own way, had been waiting for that moment for 10 months. He had not, by his master's standing instructions, killed the impostor. He had, however, with a single great soft pounce, laid the impostor on the lawn under the spotlights of the judge's tent and held him there. He had then, with the small, careful courtesy of a creature whose master had been very specific, opened, by no power but his own warm jaws, a small slit in the impostor's robe at the back of the neck. Behind the impostor's neck was a small false silver flask of polyjuice potion, hanging on a thin chain. A short way away from the impostor's neck, in the impostor's own face, the rolling magical eye of the late Alastor Moody began to slow. The crowd on the lawn in the dim did not know what they were seeing. The crowd was about to learn. Madame Bones, who, by the careful arrangement of certain communications between Severus Snape and Sirius Black and a small, calm woman in the dim, had been present in the spectator stand for the third task, in a deep navy traveling robe with her own wand, stepped onto the lawn. She walked calmly to the impostor. She said in her steady prosecutorial voice that the crowd, even on the lawn, could hear, "Alastor Moody, so called. By emergency authority of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, on a charge of impersonation and several others to be specified, I am taking you into custody. Please remain where you are." The impostor, under Mr. Cuddles's paws, said nothing. The polyjuice in his own time ran out. The face under the magical eye changed, in the small, horrible, bubbling way of such things, from Alastor Moody's wreck of a face into the smooth, young, handsome face of Barty Crouch Jr., son of Bartemius Crouch Sr., escaped convict of Azkaban, currently presumed dead, currently visibly alive on the lawn outside the Hogwarts maze in front of the entire student body and faculty of 2 foreign magical schools. Bartemius Crouch Sr. in the judge's tent, on whose lap his son's deception had been built without his knowledge, by a small, awful private intervention by his own son a year earlier, made, on seeing his son's face on the lawn, a small, unforgettable sound and sat down. The lawn was, in 5 minutes, in the unhurried administrative hands of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Harry with Cedric beside him, with Mr. Cuddles in his shadow, with Sirius, who had, by the long, quiet arrangement of his shadow father, been quietly seated all evening in the spectator stand in a thin disguise as a respectable elderly woman, coming down out of the stand at a slow walking pace toward him, stood, very tired, in the middle of the lawn. He had not, in his entire life, been more tired. He looked up. In the dim air over the lawn, the small constellation of Summer Cygnus was just visible, beyond the floodlights, against the deep evening sky. In the back of his head he heard, in the small, dry, private voice he had been hearing in dreams since he was 3, the small, precise words of his shadow father. "You have done well, Harry. Go to bed. We have one more conversation." Harry on the lawn, with Cedric's hand briefly on his shoulder and Sirius's arms now around him, and Mr. Cuddles in shadow at his foot, said in his head, "Yes, father." In the palace under the ground, on the marble desk, in the small, careful ledger, Hades closed the file marked Tom Marvolo Riddle, Resurrection Attempt 1994. He moved it from the active pile to the closing pile. The closing pile had, by then, 1 folder. He picked up the next. Chapter 7, The Lord of the Pit walks his son through the last of it. The wraith of Tom Marvolo Riddle did not, on the night of the failed graveyard ritual, accept its defeat. This is, on the small private records of the Lord of the Pit, an unusually stubborn entry in a very long career of unusually stubborn entries. Wraiths of his kind, on having their resurrection attempts foiled, generally did one of 2 things. They either dispersed, in the slow whispering way of soul fragments that had no more handles to hold to the living world, or they fled, in the small, awful way of damaged things, into deep, wild places to nurse what was left of themselves until they could try again. The Riddle Wraith, the 7th fragment, the principal, did neither. The Riddle Wraith, on Harry's calm dismissal of him in the graveyard, was, by the small, precise hand of Hades, gathered up into a holding pen 6 shelves deep in a palace under the ground. The 7th jar was placed beside the 6 other jars. The cupboard was on the night of June 24, 1994, complete. Every fragment of the soul of Tom Marvolo Riddle was now, by careful inventory, on Hades's shelf. It might be reasonably asked, in the small private vocabulary of theological audit, why the Lord of the Pit did not, at that point, simply close the file. He had everything he needed. The wraith was no longer a public danger. The soul fragments were no longer scattered. The boy who carried the seventh was, at school, safe and well and within the small, precise circle of his father's protection. The matter, on all reasonable readings, was finished. It was not, however, finished because Hades, in the small inner accounting of his palace, had decided that it would not be. He had decided that for the reason all gods of long experience decide what they decide, which was, on his particular bench, that the wraith of Tom Marvolo Riddle had not yet, with his own voice, said the word. The word was, enough. Hades in his palace did not, by his long ancient policy, grant any soul access to the standard meadow until that soul had, with its own voice in front of him in the small marble room reserved for that purpose, said enough. The saying of enough was not, by the small precise standard of his court, a formality. It was the closing of the soul's own ledger. It was the moment at which the soul accepted the score. Most souls said it within an hour of arriving. Some said it within minutes. Most said it before they knew they were saying it. A very few, the great hardened ones, the unrepentant ones, held out in small marble cells for days, weeks, months. Hades had, in his long career, kept 3 souls in his marble cells for more than a year. He had kept one, a particular Roman senator with a very long argument, for almost 2,000. He intended, with the wraith of Tom Marvolo Riddle, to take as long as it took, but he did not intend to do it alone. He intended, with the small private satisfaction of a father who had been waiting almost 14 years for the moment, to do it with his son. The conversation had taken place in dream, 3 nights after the 3rd task. Harry had fallen asleep in his small Slytherin dormitory bed on a Tuesday in late June. He had walked in his head down the long corridor of black stone. He had reached the room at the end. The room that night was the dream kitchen, with the stew on the stove, and his shadow father sitting in the wooden chair by the window with one slate-eyed gaze on the small private courtyard outside. Hades had not on that night gotten up. He had said instead, "Harry, come sit." Harry had come and sat. His shadow father had said, "I have at present in a cupboard 6 shelves deep in this palace, 7 jars. 6 of them are sealed and on a shelf. The 7th is the one I am, at present, also holding in a small marble cell, in a state I have not, in his long career, allowed your enemy to be in before. He is conscious. He is, in his small spent way, listening. I have not yet given him a chamber. I have not yet given him a meadow. I have not yet given him a verdict. He is waiting. Yes, Father. He will, by my standard procedure in time, in his own time, say the word. He may say it tomorrow. He may say it in a year. He may say it in 2000. I am in this office very patient. I will, however, in this case, do a small unprofessional thing. I will, in this case, allow you to be there when he says it. Harry, on his small chair in the dream kitchen, had looked up. He had said, "Me, Father. You, Harry. You will, by my permission, be present at the closing of the wraith of Tom Marvolo Riddle. You will, by my permission, see him as he is. You will, by my permission, hear him say it. You will not, please, by your own restraint, gloat. You will not, please, by your own restraint, mock. You will sit on a small bench by my left elbow. You will, at certain points in my judgment, be invited to speak. You will speak with the unforced courtesy I have raised you to use on creatures of certain categories. He is, despite everything, a soul. He is the worst soul I have processed in 3,000 years. He is also a soul. The dignity of the bench is the dignity of the bench. You will, please, maintain it. Yes, Father. Will you do this, Harry? Yes, Father. Good." He had paused. He had said, with the small, careful warmth that was the small, particular signature of his fatherhood, the warmth that Harry had heard in the cupboard under the stairs in Privet Drive, and on the back step by the lilac, and on the dream shore of the river that recorded oaths, and in the small marble chairs of every other room of every other dream lesson. He had said, with the small, careful warmth that he had built, over 14 years, into a kind of working language, "Harry, I want you to know this. There is no part of this that you have done badly. There is no part of this that you should not be proud of. You have, in the small held seconds of your small life so far, been more of what I had hoped a son of my line could be, in a wizarding age, than I had dared to plan. You are in particular my son, and you are also in particular your mother's son. She is, I should say, because she will be there in the meadow on the morning we go in together to close the file. She is very proud of you. So am I. Both of those are true. I tell you tonight because I do not often tell you. I should tell you more. I am, in my own old way, learning. Be patient with me. Harry in the dream kitchen, with the stew on the stove and his shadow father in the wooden chair by the window, had said in the small, unguarded voice of a boy who had not, in his short, careful life, been told these things often, "I love you, father." The shadow in the chair had, for the first time since Harry could remember, given a small, unguarded smile. He had said, "I love you, Harry, eat your stew." He had eaten his stew. The closing took place in a marble room 6 chambers deep in the Palace of Hades. It was, by the standards of the closings that had taken place in that room over 30 centuries, a small one. There were no banners, there were no choirs, there were no orators. There were only the small, precise furnishings of any of the Lord of the Pit's working rooms. A long marble desk, a small marble chair behind it, a small marble bench to the side, a small marble podium across from the desk on which the soul under consideration would be set in its small marble cell. Hades, on the night appointed, had walked into the room in his ordinary working coat, a charcoal coat that fell in lines too still for any room, and had sat at the desk. He had taken out from a single drawer a single thin black file. He had opened it. Harry, by his standing invitation, had taken his place on the small marble bench at his shadow father's left elbow. He had been, for the occasion, dressed in a small dark gray traveling cloak his shadow father had made for him in dream the night before. It was warm, it was unmarked, it hung well. It was, by its own quiet work, the kind of cloak that, in the marble rooms of Hades, was understood as the regalia of a son of the line. He had folded his hands on his knees, the way Petunia had taught him to fold them when meeting an important person, and he had waited. His shadow father had said, without looking up, "Bring him in." A small underworld attendant, the kind of attendant that, in the careful records of his palace, Hades referred to as a shade, and which was, in essence, a small soul that had elected, at the moment of its own closing, to take a position of service rather than a place in the meadow, opened the small door at the far end of the room. The attendant carried, in its small, wispy hands, a small marble cell about the size of a hat box. The cell had a small grill at the front. Inside the grill, in the dim light of the chamber, the small, spent wisp of Tom Marvolo Riddle's wraith hovered, in the corner of the cell, with its small, thin, red-eyed face turned, in its small, spent dignity, away from the door. The attendant set the cell on the podium. The attendant bowed very slightly to Hades and withdrew. Hades, at his desk, with his small, thin file open in front of him, said, in the small, dry, working voice of his bench, "Tom Marvolo Riddle. You are, by the standing records of this office, a wizard of British birth, born December 31, 1926, to Merope Gaunt and Tom Riddle Sr. You are, by the same records, deceased, irrevocably on all relevant counts, as of June 24, 1994. You are at present in the holding cell on this podium, in a state of half-existence pending closure. You will, in due course, by the procedures of this office, be allowed to say the word that will close your ledger and assign you to your final precinct. You will not, in this office, by long policy of this bench, be denied that word. You may take as long as you wish. You may take, in particular, as long as I wish. I am, by long policy of this office, very patient. I am, on this particular occasion, more patient than usual. He paused. He said, with the small, precise courtesy he used on all of his subjects, however small, "Mr. Riddle, will you please turn around? I would like to see your face." The small, spent wisp in the cell turned. It was, in the dim chamber, very small. It was the size, in his cell, of a small, ordinary house cat. It had 2 small, dim red eyes set deep in the small, thin face. It was, on inspection, almost embarrassed. Hades said, with the same small, precise courtesy, "Thank you. Mr. Riddle, do you, in this chamber, recognize the small, dark-haired boy on the bench to my left?" The wisp in the cell looked, very slowly, with its small, dim red eyes, at Harry. Harry on the bench with his small, folded hands said nothing. He had been instructed not to. The wisp said in its small, dry, rasping voice, "I do. He is Potter. He is Mr. Riddle. He is also, for the purposes of this office, my son. Are you in this chamber surprised?" The wisp considered. It said after a long, careful moment, "I am not. You are not. Good. Mr. Riddle, have you, on review, anything to say to him on the closure of your file?" There was in the chamber a long marble silence. The wisp in its cell did the small, grim courtesy of considering. Hades did not press. Harry on the bench did not speak. The wisp at last, in its small, spent voice, said, "Boy, I had thought when I cast that spell on the night your mother died that I had won. I had thought in the years afterward, when I was a wraith, that I would in time come back and win the rest. I had thought in the year of your school, every year of your school, that I would by the next term find an angle. I thought it again this year in the graveyard. I thought in the graveyard that one more push would do it. I was wrong. I have been wrong at every turn since the night I went to your cottage. I was wrong from the start. I am sorry, boy. I do not know what other word the bench would prefer. I will use that one. I am sorry. I made an enormous, immoderate fool of myself against a god whose name I should have asked before raising my wand. I will in any case no longer trouble you." There was a small held silence. Hades at his desk said, "Mr. Riddle, do you know who I am?" I do, you are Hades." "I am Mr. Riddle, do you accept the closure of your ledger?" The wisp in its cell said in its small spent voice, "Lord, I accept." Mr. Riddle, on the small private question of precinct, by the long policy of this bench, you will spend an interval of time, by the small precise accounting of your acts, in a particular corner of the precinct of the asphodel. The corner is the one reserved for those who, in their living lives, attempted to escape this bench by means of which this bench did not approve. The interval will be, on my calculations, of the order of 1.5 millennia. You will not, in that corner, be tortured. You will only be quiet. You will be required, in particular, to sit in a small bare marble chair by the bank of a river that does not move, and to consider, for as long as it takes, what you ought to have done with the time you had. At the end of the interval you may, by application to the bench, be considered for reassignment. Do you understand? Lord, I understand. Have you, Mr. Riddle, any final word? The wisp in its cell paused for a long time. It said at last, in a voice so small that Harry on the bench had to lean very slightly forward to hear, Boy, look, you are what I would have been, perhaps, if my mother had not, if I had not, I am sorry. I do not have any more words. I am tired." Hades at his desk said with the small precise courtesy of his bench, "Mr. Riddle, we are at the closing word." The wisp in its cell said, with the small spent dignity of every soul that had ever come in its time before the bench of Hades, and said the small old word, "Enough." The cell on the podium dimmed. The small dim red eyes of the wisp in the cell closed. The wisp in the cell was gone. The cell on the podium was empty. The small ledger on the desk closed itself very gently with a small marble click. Harry on the bench sat very still. His shadow father at the desk did not for a long-held second speak. He looked with his slate-eyed gaze at the closed ledger. He looked in the small private way of a lord of accounts who had just closed a long-running file at his own folded hands. He looked at last at his son. He said in the small, careful working voice of his bench, "Harry." "Yes, father." "Stand up, please, come here." Harry on the bench stood up. He walked in his small gray traveling cloak, the 4 paces from the bench to the desk. His shadow father at the desk did not in his ordinary way embrace him. He did, however, lay one long pale hand on his small living shoulder and hold it there. He said in the small careful voice of his bench, in the small careful voice of his fatherhood, in the small careful voice that was, by long quiet effort, both at once, "It is done, Harry. There is no Voldemort. There is no enemy. There is, however, still the scar." He paused. He said with the small dry courtesy of a god who had been preparing this moment in his own slow way for 14 years, "I will remove the 7th fragment from your scar now. I will please ask you to sit in this chair. It will not hurt. It will, however, be strange. You will, for a small held second, feel a great cold, then you will feel a great warmth, then you will feel ordinary. The scar will remain. It will be in time just a scar. It will not, after tonight, ever again carry anything that is not yours. Do you accept?" Harry in the small gray traveling cloak, with his small steady green eyes, with his shadow father's hand on his small living shoulder, said, in the small unforced voice he had been saving for the small particular moments at which it was earned, "Yes, father, I accept." His shadow father sat him in the chair. His shadow father stood behind him. His shadow father laid both long pale hands on his small living head, one on each side, with the small precise grip of a god who had done many such operations, and had not in 3,000 years made a single error, and said, in the long dry working language of his palace, 3 short words. There was a great cold. There was a great warmth. There was ordinary. The 7th jar on the cupboard 6 shelves deep in the palace, with its 6 brothers, gave a small soft hiss, the way an old kettle hisses when it accepts the heat. The cupboard on its own time closed. Harry in the chair, with his small living head with the small lightning scar on his forehead, opened his eyes. He looked up at his shadow father. He said with the small unguarded smile he had been saving for the small particular set of moments at which it was earned, "Father, father." "Hello." His shadow father behind him, with his long pale hand still on the small living head, gave at last, in the small private chamber 6 chambers deep in his palace, the long careful smile that he had been saving for 14 years, and said, "Hello, son." The morning afterward, in the small dim corridor of his Slytherin dormitory, Harry woke. He sat up. He put his hand to his forehead briefly. The scar on his forehead was on first touch simply a scar. It was warm. It was unremarkable. It was by his small private internal accounting, he got up, he washed, he dressed, he went down to breakfast. The hall on the last morning of term was full of the small, ordinary noise of 14-year-olds packing for home. Hermione, at the Gryffindor table, was reading a small, thick book of the kind she read whenever she was very tired. Ron, beside her, was eating, in the small, steady way of a 14-year-old who knew there was a long train ride between him and his next meal. Cedric, at the Hufflepuff table, looked up from his porridge and gave Harry a small, unforced nod that Harry, with the small, unguarded honesty he had reserved for the small, particular set of people who had earned it, returned. Draco, at the Slytherin table, made small, careful room beside him. Pansy, on Draco's other side, said in her small Slytherin drawl, "Potter, you look better than usual." Harry, in his small Slytherin robe, sitting down on the bench, said, "Thank you, Pansy, I am in fact better than usual." He ate his breakfast. He looked at the high table. Dumbledore was reading a newspaper. McGonagall was watching the hall with her small, careful, steady gaze. Snape was watching Harry. Snape, on catching Harry's eye, gave one small, precise inclination of the head. Harry, with the small, careful steadiness his shadow father had drilled into him, returned it. He finished his breakfast. He went to pack. The train on the way south was the same long red engine in the same small steam cloud at the same Hogsmeade station, going the other way. Harry rode in the same compartment, as he had on the way up with the same three friends. Draco in the corner had his small, thick book of Quidditch openings. Hermione in the other corner had a fresh, thick book of the kind she would, by the end of the train ride, have finished. Ron, beside Hermione, was already eating Bertie Bott's every flavor beans from the trolley. Mr. Cuddles, in the shadow of the compartment, was, by his master's own express instruction, allowed, on this particular train ride, to nap with his enormous black snout on his master's lap. Harry, with one hand on his hellhound's wide, warm head and the other in his own jumper pocket, with the small, steady warmth of his small Cerberus Patronus, which had, after his father's small private closure the previous night, become in some small, steady way, even larger and even cooler, and even more thoroughly the small, icy paw print of his own particular soul, sat by the window and watched, in the small, careful, peaceful way of a 14-year-old who had finished his year's work. The green and gray Scottish countryside slide past. Draco, in the corner, looked up from his book. He said in his small, careful drawl, "Potter, where are you going for the summer?" Harry, by the window, said, "London, Grimmauld Place, with my godfather. And then Privet Drive for 3 weeks. Aunt Petunia wants to see me." "Oh," said Draco, with the small, careful courtesy he had been quietly building up all year. "Then we should visit. Mother has been wanting all year to invite you. Father has been making careful adjustments to his thinking. He will, I think, by August be ready to be polite. Mother is, in any case, already ready." "All right then, Draco. Send an invitation by owl, please, addressed to the Surrey postbox my aunt uses. She'll forward it. I'd like that very much." "Yes, Potter." Hermione, in her corner, looking up over her book, said in her small, careful Granger voice, "Harry." "Yes, Hermione. Are you really all right?" Harry, by the window, with his hand on Mr. Cuddles's wide, warm head, and his small, steady Cerberus Patronus quiet in his pocket, and his small shadow father, somewhere very far below them, watching with the small, dry approval of the Lord of Accounts, the small green and gray Scottish countryside sliding past the window of his son's train. Harry, in his small Slytherin robe, with the small lightning scar on his forehead, now simply a scar, with the small, careful, unguarded green eyes his mother had given him. With the small, careful, steady honesty his father's, both of them, had been quietly building into him for 14 years, said, in the small, unforced voice, he had been saving for the small, particular set of people who had earned it. "Yes, Hermione, I am in fact all right." She nodded. She went back to her book. Ron, in the seat opposite, looked up from his beans. He said with the small, unforced Weasley honesty that had been the small, particular property of his friendship with Harry for 4 years, "Mate, I want you to know. I noticed you weren't a normal lad 3 weeks into first year. I never asked. I want you to know I never will. You're my mate, that's the whole of it." Harry, with the small, unguarded smile he had been saving for the small, particular set of moments at which it was earned, said, "Thank you, Ron Bean. Yeah, here. The yellow ones are usually pineapple. The brown ones, mate, do not eat the brown ones." Draco, in the corner, watching this with the small Slytherin patience of a boy who had decided, over the year, that he would, in the end, learn to like the Weasleys, said, "Are the brown ones really earwax?" "Sometimes earwax, sometimes coffee. It's a roulette, mate. The blue ones are blueberry. The black ones are pepper." The train ride, in the small, careful way of all of Harry's school years, was, for the 4 of them, the small, ordinary, unending small comfort of friends going home together. Harry, by the window, with one hand on Mr. Cuddles's wide, warm head, watched the small green and gray Scottish countryside slide past. In his small private head, in the small private back of its space where his shadow father lived, there was at last, after 14 long years of careful work, only the small, steady, patient warmth of a father who was, for the moment, watching with the small, dry approval of the Lord of the Pit, his son go home. The voice in his head said only, "Well done, Harry, go home, eat, sleep, come and see me on Saturday and dream. We have many quiet years ahead of us. You have done your dark work. The rest of your life is, by my fatherly insistence, yours." Harry by the window in his small Slytherin robe, with the small lightning scar on his forehead, now simply a scar, with the small Cerberus Patronus quiet in his pocket and the small steady warmth of his hellhound on his lap, said in his head, with the small unforced honesty he had reserved for the small particular set of people who had earned it, "Yes, father. Thank you, father. I will see you Saturday. I love you, father." In a palace very far under the ground, behind a long marble desk, with a small closed file on his right and the small steady image of his son on the small green Scottish train in his head, Hades, the lord of the pit, the lord of accounts, the husband of Persephone, the brother of Zeus and Poseidon, the long quiet keeper of the meadow of the asphodel and the river of the Styx, and the small bone holding pens 6 shelves deep in the cupboard at the back of his working chamber, said, in his small, dry, private voice, to no one and to his son, "I love you, Harry. Go home, son." The train, in the small, careful way of all of Harry's school years, in the small, careful way of all small, careful trains in all small, careful stories, in the small, careful way of all the small green and gray Scottish countrysides that have ever slid past all the small, careful Slytherin schoolboys riding home in all the small, careful summers, slid south. It slid south through the small, careful evening, into the small, careful end of all small, careful Tuesdays, into the small, careful end of the small, careful, long, careful year, into the small, careful end, at last, by long, careful work and longer, careful patience, by the small, careful, deep, unflashy, very nearly invisible love of a god of accounts for a small, dark-haired Slytherin schoolboy with vivid green eyes and a small lightning scar that after tonight was only ever a scar. It slid south into the small, careful evening of the rest of his life, the end.